This world trembled when it heard about the one whose name itself was cursed. He was the real Dark Lord of all the evil that existed on the planet. There was no one who was equal in strength to him, and accordingly could resist. But one day the story changed a little, when one of the warriors knocked down the doors in order to enter the chambers of the Dark Lord. As soon as he went inside, looking at the throne of the Dark Lord, he ordered him to leave immediately. The Dark Lord looked at this guest and said that in fact he was not hiding. The warrior took off his helmet and said that he was glad to meet you, and immediately revealed all his cards, saying that he came here to kill him. For he, a warrior named Furin the Strong, the one who will destroy evil once and for all. The Dark Lord said that this warrior has a lot of pride in his soul, but as soon as he said this, Furin immediately ordered him to be silent. He was about to start telling something, but suddenly he felt the movement of some energy right next to his body at that moment. This energy became more and more bright and filled more and more space in the room, and was like a strong wind. All this energy flew into the body of the Dark Lord, and then he said that most likely Furin would not mind if they dispensed with small talk and started the battle. But he replied that he began his speech because he had been harboring these thoughts for years. Therefore, he asked his opponent not to distract him and let him voice everything as it should be. The Dark Lord did not want to do this and, pointing his sword at the enemy, ordered him to close his mouth right now. Moreover, he was wondering why this particular warrior believed that he was the strongest compared to other people who came here. Furin the Strong did not even want to answer this, since this question itself was humiliation for him. Since he considered himself the strongest warrior, he was chosen to destroy all evil, and he came here to behead this very evil. He ordered the Dark Lord to see the legacy of the Great Sword of Glory, the eradicator of all evil. But for some reason, from the energy that he held in his hand, not a holy sword appeared, but an ordinary rough goblin axe. He was very surprised when this happened, and did not understand why he now had in his hand not the most powerful artifact in the world. The Dark Lord said that he slightly doubts that the holy sword looks like an ordinary crude goblin axe. Then the warrior asked him to wait, since he only now remembered that the real sword was in a magic pouch in the pocket dimension, where a large number of weapons could be placed. Energy gushed out of this bag again, and then the warrior shouted that now the Dark Lord could see the real holy sword. But this time, too, something went wrong, and the warrior had an ancient staff of an ancient spirit in his hands. I was already a little ashamed, but the warrior still began to use the bag to sort through a large number of different items. After a few seconds, he managed to get the legendary huge magnificent demon slayer of the first people out of there. Undoubtedly it was a good weapon, but still not what the strong Furin was trying to get from a magic bag. It only took a few tries, and so the warrior used the bag again until he pulled out something very incomprehensible. He quickly remembered that it was called a fast-moving semi-automatic punisher from another world. The Dark Lord decided that he needed to stop being silent, and told the warrior that this was already becoming boring, and asked him to attack if he did not have the holy sword too. But the strong Furin did not even listen to him, since he was very puzzled about finding the holy sword in this bag. Time passed, and the warrior very quickly realized that it seemed that that particular sword was not in the bag, since he had already pulled out almost all the items that were in it. Meanwhile, the Dark Lord raised his sword up, thereby creating a discharge of energy in the air, and shouted that it was no longer important. He ordered the warrior to attack, but at that moment he only wondered where this weapon could have gone. A realization came to his head, which did not at all calm his already shaky mind and psyche. It seems that Furin the Strong simply lost his holy sword, and now was not the best time to do it. It was not clear what to do, since none of the weapons that he took out of the magic bag could withstand such a strong opponent. 30 years have come, and the action has moved to a secluded dungeon, which people also nicknamed the Forgotten Citadel. Here, any second now, a battle between a light warrior and a dark spirit was supposed to take place. In fact, the preparatory part for the battle already took place, since the warrior spent a very large amount of energy on the first attacks. The evil spirit said only one word in a quiet voice that was like a whisper. He also added that this was all just mortal boredom, considering that it had just been almost a battle with the guardian of the forgotten Xylix citadel. He even wanted to say that the warriors would never defeat him with such a pathetic sword. But it was at this moment that the adventurer decided to strike. And, surprisingly, Just one blow was enough for this guardian to lie on the floor without signs of life in a moment. The adventurer looked at his lifeless body and could not understand how this could happen so quickly and easily. But still, it was necessary to say this pathetic phrase, so looking straight into the eyes of the killed enemy, he said that he was a rather strong opponent. This guard's entire body began to change, and little by little, it began to emit blue energy and laugh. When the laughter ended, the guardian thanked the adventurer for such a pleasant compliment, and the energy in his bones became even greater. The warrior realized that he could sheath his sword, since after a few seconds the entire body of the guard almost completely turned into blue plasma. This warrior's name was Johnson, and he was the most ordinary adventurer. The holy sword, which was passed down from generation to generation, has long disappeared along with the last warrior who owned it, and this adventurer, together with his comrades, decided to go on an adventure to find him. They carried out their search, fighting against many cruel enemies. They have finally found a dungeon in which a special magical blade may be hidden. This place was much scarier and more dangerous than Johnson imagined. While he was walking along one of the corridors, he suddenly heard someone's voice behind him, who ordered him to stop immediately. He turned his head to see who it was, and was already scared because he believed that he had eliminated all the opponents here. Johnson was incredibly surprised when he realized that these two were still alive in the end. In fact, behind him at that time stood Mr. Magician and Mr. Archer, who should have already been dead in Johnson's opinion. The warrior asked them if they had come across anything particularly dangerous before that moment, and the archer replied that so far everything had been relatively smooth. Then the magician interrupted him and said that on the way they came across a hidden boss, but this did not help. The archer even suggested that perhaps they were put on the wrong trail. Looking at the map, the warrior concluded that he was counting on this information, since their group had to pay a considerable amount to the Thieves' Guild for the map. The archer did not particularly like this phrase, since he believed that the warrior was forced to try the stewed grass in the near future. But he justified himself, saying that he was ready to do a lot for the sake of adventure. He also added that like a small boat, they moved towards their goal, overcoming deprivation and adversity. This was their journey. The journey of the pilgrims in search of the Holy Sword, so in his opinion there was no point in being happy or sad over a couple of coins. Coins that were spent in the name of the legacy of the great warrior. The archer did not agree with this either, so he asked a warrior named Johnson to show his bag. The magician, who was not engaged in dialogue and was simply listening, ordered the two of them to be silent, as he began to feel an overabundance of mana. The shaking became much stronger when he said this, and then the small group began to really panic. The magician said that it seems that the moment has come when it comes. He pointed his finger at the doors that were located at the end of the corridor, and said that all this energy comes from that point. The archer said that from such an amount of mana even his skin was covered with goosebumps, and the warrior, in turn, warned that the battle would most likely be difficult. From behind the doors that were located at the end of the corridor, one could suddenly see a small stream of dust rushing towards the group. A moment later, through a small hole that appeared in the door, some kind of monster could be seen. The warrior ordered his group to get ready, and in the meantime the archer asked the Lord to look after them. The doors opened even more, and then the dark spirit ordered the group to run away while they still have legs. When the door opened completely, the group now saw the full outline of their enemy, and felt the power he possessed. The warrior ordered the enemy to shut his dirty mouth, and said that they would never run away from the enemy. Then the dark spirit told them that they had misunderstood him, and again ordered them to run away. Then something very strong hit him in the head. Looking closer, the group realized that someone was standing behind him, and with just one movement, they pierced his head with their sword. The magician had absolutely no idea what had just happened, just like Johnson. In front of them stood someone who looked very human, and who was holding a sword with a red blade in his hand. The warrior aimed his weapon at this stranger, and ordered him to introduce himself immediately. This man didn't say anything for a while, then suddenly said in a whisper that the holy sword was not here. He raised his head and shouted very loudly, ordering the group to bring him the holy sword now. The groups were very scared as they all had very different opinions about who was now right in front of them. The magician, for example, suggested that perhaps now they see the wrath of the holy sword in front of them. This is a man who fell victim to the curse of those who died in his search. He is tormented on an endless journey, searching for him and killing everyone in his path. The so-called cursed spirit, the magician, had only this version of who it was. Johnson decided to ask his comrade if he wanted to say that that monstrous flow of mana came from him, and not from the dark spirit. The magician did not answer him anything to this, but only said that he needed to run away. The warrior strongly disagreed with this. He ran up to the enemy at high speed and said that angry spirits also die if they are hit properly. Johnson tried to strike his opponent's body with his sword, but at the very last moment Thoth grabbed him right by the blade. An instant later, the enemy struck Johnson in the face with the hilt of his sword. Despite the fact that visually this blow did not look particularly powerful, the warrior immediately flew to the side at high speed and hit the floor. The archer realized that now was his time, and he must begin to attack the enemy. Several arrows were fired at him at once, but thanks to some skill, the enemy fought them off with his sword. The archer did not understand how this could happen in general, since he had just used arrows that did not miss. But it seems that this enemy didn't care what the arrows were called. He got close to the archer, and was already preparing to strike with his sword, until he heard a sound behind him. The archer very quickly realized that this was his chance, and therefore shouted to the magician to use magic now. The magician did not think very long, and used his staff to direct harmful energy into the enemy's body. He tried to channel all his life energy into this staff, and used a flash, which was a short-range teleportation spell. The archer realized that the effect of this spell did not affect the enemy, but rather the magician simply wanted to leave. Therefore, he shouted that, unfortunately, according to the pirate code, they are obliged to abandon those lagging behind, since it is natural that those who can survive should simply run away. He was not destined to finish his sentence, since the enemy threw his sword at him, and the hilt hit him right on the forehead. After this happened, the magician fell to the floor and stopped even moving and emitting any energy. The archer turned to this man and asked him if he had heard what they were talking about before all this happened. He seemed not to listen to the archer, but only turned in his direction and asked if he had a holy sword. At first it was better not to look at him, and then he said that he did not have this great artifact. A moment later, he and the magician were already lying on the floor, and did not even move. The enemy pulled their bodies into one pile so that they would not take up so much space in the corridor. After he did this, he heard that the warrior he had eliminated first was still breathing, and could even speak. Johnson told this man that he had nothing to do with undead creatures. And seeing the monstrous flow of mana, he now understood everything. He was also identified by his skills, which are beyond ordinary people: blonde hair and deep turquoise eyes. According to Johnson, among all the people he knows, there is only one who specifically fits this description. Warrior Furin is strong. Johnson started shouting that he was a devoted fan, and decided to ask him for an autograph at that moment. But the man, instead of giving an autograph, only came closer to Johnson and put his hand on his face. In a quiet voice he said that that warrior had fallen, and he was 100% sure of it. When Johnson wanted to ask him again, he replied that this man died as much as 30 years ago. He added that the warrior disappeared without a trace after a fierce and bloody battle. The warrior began to shout that this could not be, since everyone knows that that warrior disappeared along with the holy sword. And according to Johnson, this warrior was precisely this man. Johnson said that the man should come back because the world still remembers him. He began to scream about something else, but it was at that moment that the man hit him with one of his fingers, and thereby instantly turned off Johnson. Now the warrior's body lay on the floor, and the man thought for a few seconds before saying the following. He noticed that such people talk a lot, especially those who know nothing, often shout the loudest. The warrior not only abandoned his comrades, but also chose to survive as the last pathetic coward. And in addition, he lost the holy sword. The warrior Furin the Strong, who was 56 years old, spent 30 years in order to find the holy sword. The action shifted again, and this time it was a fierce battle of one of the greatest wars. The enemies, who this time were dead, screamed very loudly and constantly tried to retreat, but those who defended their lands held their swords tightly in their hands, preparing to destroy all opponents that day. The commander of the troops constantly ordered his squad not to retreat, and to give peace to the damn rebels. He constantly launched horizontal-type attacks at his enemies, and with just one blow he could tear them apart. This was their chance to make their names in history, and they took this chance very enthusiastically. Suddenly, the commander of a small unit heard the magician who was standing next to him say that he had run out of mana. The dwarf who was also standing at a short distance said that the enemies were attacking again, and we needed to prepare. The commander gave the order to his troops and also to all his comrades to attack, since the best defense is an attack, as is known. He continued to strike and destroy opponents left and right, but at one moment something happened that made him stop and put his sword in front of him for protection. It was a stream of energy that pierced the bodies of 2 knights who stood near the commander. This could only mean that the fiercest battle had not yet occurred. The dwarf said that everything would be fine, and the commander, in turn, noted that now that the main enemy is here, they can tense up again. Before them was none other than the Lord of the Dead, the first of the 4 commanders of the Dark Lord. He was called the Phantom King, and he drew his sword, at the same time telling the commander that he was glad to meet him, and tried to introduce himself. But the commander interrupted him, and said that his name was not called. Then he tried again, and was interrupted again. The commander threw off his helmet, and said that he was not going to listen to people like him now. In fact, all this time this commander was a girl who was one of the strongest sword warriors. She introduced herself and said that her name is Arel Alphen, and this time she will take care of the enemy personally. But the dwarf who was still standing next to the commander said that it seemed that this time there was no need for it. All because among the crowd of other warriors there was one who stood out thanks to his uncovered head and his hair. Furin himself came to this fight. When Arel Alphen noticed him, she immediately asked him to come here as soon as possible. Furin apologized and said that he didn't expect them to have fun here without him, and the Lord of the Dead added that he was already bored. Strong decided to ask the enemy what brought him here and what amused him, while simultaneously addressing him by name. Then the villain said that his name was different, but since his enemies called him nothing, then this is his new name. The man was silent for a while, and then said that this makes sense, but still he wants to call him as the named one from now on. He began to take his meme out of the bag, and ordered the new one to assemble immediately. And he also added that there should be no doubt about it, since this weapon will haunt him in his worst dreams. The Lord of the Dead laughed and asked what this terrifying thing was, which seemed to be some kind of magic sword. But then the warrior said that this was nothing more than a holy sword, which with just one movement could kill the Lord of the Dead. The action shifted, and in the place where the Furin was now located, the sky was incredibly clear. He rode in a carriage with the rest of the people, and constantly repeated only 2 words: Holy Sword. His gaze was absolutely insane, and because of this, the man who was riding in the carriage with him felt incredibly uncomfortable. He scared him very much the whole way, but he had to endure it, since he had to get to his destination. After some time, the cart stopped, and the strong Furin realized that it looked like they had arrived at the place. The one who was sitting and driving the cart turned his head towards the customers and said that they had arrived. This place was called the Frightening Cursed Terrible Valley, which you can enter but cannot exit. At the same time, getting off the cart, the strong Furin said that this is a very long name for one place. Then the second client said that this was a den of ghosts, and added that an odd number of switchers went missing after entering it. In addition, there were rumors that the Phantom King lived there, about whom everyone had already heard for a long time. This Ghost King was the Lord of the Dead, and the first Ghost King among the 12 liches to be named. Furin said that that terrifying guy who cursed all living things and led an army of ghosts seems to be still alive. One of those who was in the cart decided to ask Furin what a man at his age needed here. Did he really want to come here? He replied that there was nothing special about it. He just heard that there was a legendary sword here, and so he came here to check. The man who was in the cart and asked all these questions suddenly locked up when Furin the Strong threw some kind of wrapped object at him. When that man tried to unpack this gift, he saw there a magical blade of a forgotten citadel, which radiated incredible power. The warrior said that this was compensation, but also recommended that the people in the cart not allow the power to cloud his mind. A moment later, the cart drove away at high speed, and the man who received such a valuable gift waved his sword in different directions and shouted with joy. Now the warrior stood here himself, and thought only that most likely in the place where he wanted to go there would be a legendary sword. He took a few steps forward, and in his head now there was only the thought that most likely the goal of all his travels would be right here. When he found himself inside, he realized that there would also be a very large number of not the weakest enemies. These were dead men who were not particularly intelligent or fast, but they screamed very terribly. Firkin, this was not particularly frightening, so he found a small stick and hit one of the dead on the head with it. He then shouted that he didn't like him being so noisy, and then the dead man said that he just had a little anger management problems. After this, the dead man thought a little and said that despite all this, it is forbidden to enter here with a living person, so the warrior puts him in a difficult position. Meanwhile, there were even more dead people, and they gradually began to surround the only living soul who was now in the cave. They quietly asked who dared to come here, and ordered him to get out if he wanted to continue living. But then the warrior once again hit one of the dead on the head, and ordered him to bring the legendary sword, but he did not understand anything. One of the dead decided to stand up for his brother and tried to strike the driver, and at the same time shouted that he needed to stop mocking the dead. The man did not appreciate this gesture, and said that he thought that they would be able to achieve a common goal through dialogue. Moments later, the dead man was struck, and he said that now this dead man is free from the cycle of life and death. After this, a whole series of blows to the dead began, and their bodies were scattered into small parts, and these parts were scattered over a long distance. They didn't understand how this could even happen, because ghosts are supposed to ignore physical damage. The warrior was not going to stop and, swinging this stick that looked like a bone, said that the time had come for the dead to see the Buddha. Because of this, the opponents immediately began to scatter in all directions and at the same time shout that they did not want to die again. The man realized that this was what needed to be proven, namely that violence is an excellent way of communication. At some point, Firkin heard whose voice it was, which said that this was the same intruder. When the man turned his head, he saw that there was a dead man standing there, next to whom was an image that vaguely resembled his friend. This dead man bowed down and asked the Lord of the Dead to give justice to this living man. Vladika immediately said that he did not expect to see a person here, so he asked him to introduce himself. The man replied that the ruler could be understood, since a lot of water had passed under the bridge since their last meeting. He invited him to have fun the same way they had fun when they met for the first time. After that, he called him named. The villain thought for a second, after which a realization came to his mind. Now he realized that in front of him was none other than a warrior named Firkin the Strong. For several seconds, the two old acquaintances looked at each other, until the warrior asked the Lord of the Dead if he remembered him. A smile appeared on the Lord's face, and he slowly said that he remembered that moment very well. He could not forget the face of the offender who had once dared to trample on his dignity, and he remembered his name well. Then the man said that in those days the Lord of the Dead behaved badly, and for this he had to answer. And now the warrior is only an old man, so he recommended that the Lord of the Dead put aside his worries. He also added that he is no longer a warrior, since he long ago renounced the name Firkin the Strong. This was surprising for the villain, and he said that he had never heard of one restless old man who suddenly decided to shake his bones. Moreover, the Lords of the Dead wanted to get closer to the essence of the matter, and he asked what brought the man here. Was it really the thirst for killing? Then he said that he was definitely not interested in such goals, and added that in fact he was here to get the legendary sword. When the villain asked him what he meant when he talked about the legendary sword, the man asked him not to lie. After a short pause, Firkin also said that he already knew that a weapon capable of cutting through the skies was located right here. He pointed his stick at the villain and ordered him to bring him this weapon, otherwise he would have to die. Then the Lord of the Dead laughed and said that the man was actually right, and the legendary sword was really here. But there was one problem, which was that the Lord of the Dead is a lich, and more specifically, the one who has surpassed death itself. It seemed to him that an old warrior like the warrior could not defeat him, and in general his words could be heard to have quite strong self-confidence. The man said that in this case he would torture the Lord of the Dead until he began to beg for death. The villain countered that he had one question. Didn't Firkin wield the greatest blade of all, the holy sword? It was not clear how it happened that he needed another. The warrior needed some time to think, and he said in a low voice that he was looking for the legendary sword, because he did not have the holy sword. Then the villain said that he definitely remembers that he used to have this sword, but the man replied that now he doesn't have it. This phrase again caused laughter and a smile on the Lord's face, as he could not believe his ears, and believe the fact that the greatest war had lost the holy sword. He couldn't believe that the mighty warrior was so stupid that he made such a mistake and lost such a significant relic. Moreover, the villain even thought that it was possible to use him for his own purposes, and therefore he simply lies about the true purpose of visiting the cave. The man turned to his opponent and said that the Lord had a very good tongue. He swung his stick and said that now his plans have changed, and now he wants to chat a little. Of course, he meant the language of brute force, and since the villain also understood this, he began to quickly dodge. In parallel with this, the Lord of the Dead tried to talk with Furin, since such battles were completely useless for him now. But it seems that the man had no time for this at all, since his blows only became more and more powerful over time. The first of the 4 commanders of the Dark Lord suddenly stopped, and thus it was quite easy for the warrior to strike him with his stick. A small explosion occurred, after which the Lord's body flew to the side and scattered into several dark particles. Through the dust and explosion, the man heard the words of the villain, who told him that he was no longer his equal. Despite all these words, Furin was still as focused as possible, and listened to how the villain said that this was the land of the dead. He also saw before his eyes how the villains became after a rather impressive missed blow, and looked into the eyes of his opponent, after which he said that in a place teeming with corpses, it is obvious that no one can defeat the Lord of the Dead. He made a gesture with his hand, which meant an order, and the Reaper, who was the summoned spirit, had to kill the warrior. The man didn't understand what it meant, so he quickly ran up to his opponent and hit him on the head several times with a stick. A few seconds later, the same Reaper appeared in the air, who was the strongest ghost that radiated energy. But for some reason, after just a few moments, this Reaper could not even move. It turns out that this all happened because the man was able to hold back a very important part of his body with one hand. For a while, the Reaper simply looked at his opponent and said nothing, thinking through what to do next. A moment, and his physical shell began to disappear, and in a whisper you could hear him say that it was probably better for him to just leave now. However, the weapon of this same Reaper was still in reality, and specifically in the hands of the warrior. He stood with this weapon in his hands in front of the Lord of the Dead, and fear filled his dark soul. The villain realized that it would be best for him to retreat, and at the same time shouted that in front of him was a real monstrous beast. The man liked part of the Reaper's weapon, and he said that he was counting to 3, and hoped that the villain would bring him the sword before the end of time. His gaze was serious, and the Lord of the Dead realized that now he needed to use all his strength to defeat his opponent. There was a crazy smile on his face, and he told the warrior that this time he would not get off so easily. His body began to emit energy, which at lightning speed turned into tens and hundreds of very sharp crystals that flew at high speed. He tried to focus his gaze on the target in order to see what all these shells would do to the warrior's body. But when the dust settled, the first of the Dark Lord's 4 commanders realized that this fight would not be won easily. In front of him was a Furin, who was still holding part of the Reaper's scythe, and who said only one word. The smile became less noticeable, as the villain realized that he would have to resort to the most desperate steps. A sword appeared in his hands, and he said that he would now show the enemy what he had learned during the 30 years that they had not seen each other. A second later he was already kneeling in front of Furin, and holding a sword above his head, presenting it to the warrior. The man said that he was glad that finally his efforts in the negotiations were justified. The dead who stood at a safe distance from the battle site said that this was a real humiliation. The Lord of the Dead at this time was only thinking about what a warrior could do all these 30 years since he became so strong. You could also notice in his eyes that he was looking too closely at the sword. He did this in silence until he asked the Lord if this was really the same sword. The villain's voice began to tremble, and he said that this was the same legendary blade called the Long Sword. The man couldn't believe it, and said the phrase long sword out loud several times. When there was another pause, he again began to very slowly count to 3. After that, the villain fell to his knees even lower and said that they never had the legendary sword, and it was just a rumor that they created to attract adventurers. Due to the recent outbreak of plague and the protracted war, they completely stopped visiting the cave. And this was their only way to collect the souls of adventurers. Furin gathered his strength, took a full lungful of air, and shouting asked the villain what was the point of telling him about all this. In response, the Lord only laughed, and then the warrior said that in any case there was no point in killing him. Because he does what he must, he survives. The villain couldn't believe that this man wouldn't harm him, and it looked like he was just going to let him go. Then Furin said that he could deal with him whenever he wanted, but his coming here initially did not have such a purpose. Of course, the warrior could kill him, but most likely the Lord of the Dead will simply resurrect after a while, so this is an irrational use of time. The man began to leave, but at some point stopped because he was confused by one word. Meanwhile, the villain came closer to his new friend and said that he expected justice from the warrior, like a hero. Then Furin suddenly put his hand on the Lord's shoulders and asked him if he could bring the deceased back to life. He was interested in resurrection, not in the form of a thoughtless ghost, but it was about a full-fledged resurrection. Then the Lord of the Dead laughed and asked the man who he thought he was, "Is it really a divine dragon who works miracles?" However, he also added that it is possible to summon a soul by placing it in another body. However, this is the essence of liches. He laughed and squeezed the Lord of the Dead's shoulder even harder, who at that second no longer understood anything at all. The face of Furin the Strong became insane, and he whispered an order to the Lord of the Dead to create a lich for him. The action moved to another place, where a knight who was dressed in full equipment was moving through the forest. He was accompanied by a certain man who was wearing a hood. While they were moving, they at some point attracted the attention of a small gang of bandits who often robbed people in the forest. They immediately perceived the two as victims, and came out of their hiding places to rob. Warriors in full iron armor addressed the bandits and ordered them to get away, otherwise he would cut their throats. But one of the bandits just at that moment shot at him with his bow and pierced his head. Then the second bandit, who came closer to the two unknown travelers, ordered the hooded man to give everything he had, or die like his friend. But the man who was wearing a cloak began to use energy on the corpse, and said that these bandits are real fools. He also added that he could not believe that some bandits actually decided to attack them. The warrior, in a grumbling voice, said that he had nothing to offer except a long and painful death in a deep forest. The bandits were very scared when the corpse spoke, and this could be clearly seen from their frightened faces. Then one of them, who seemed to be the commander, said that it was just arisen, and you just need to kill the one who just raised him. But when the sword of this bandit touched the body of an unknown man, his blade shattered into many metal fragments. A second later, the man said in a quiet voice that he once argued with the sun about who would be the first to deprive the bandits of their clothes. And then the sun heated their clothes white hot with the heat that was hot lava, and burned their bodies to the very bones. But what the sun really wanted was to remove the mask from this rotten world. To burn and purify all evil means to remove the heavy armor from those who live in it. Burn and throw away the bodies of the wicked. A large fire sphere appeared right above this man's head, and he shouted at the top of his lungs that this is the only salvation that can break the shackles of humanity and atone for sins. Screams that called for sinners to die, or a sphere of fire, caused the bandits to run away. For some time, the hooded man still remained in character and continued to scream in order to intimidate the bandits. But very quickly he got tired of it and stopped using energy to maintain the fireball above his head. After this, it became obvious that the hood could now be removed, and if at least one of the bandits had remained here, he would have seen who this man really was. The one who was in iron armor said that blowing up everything here in order to catch one bandit was irrational. But the warrior replied that despite its size, the fireball inside was empty. He also added that it seems that the Lord of the Dead also has talent, as he was able to survive an arrow to the head. The first of the 4 commanders of the Dark Lord took off his helmet and said that he was a lich, and therefore such damage was not a problem for him. The bandit who struck the warrior's body with his sword was now lying on the ground, and was stripped down to his underpants. His clothes now belonged to the Lord of the Dead, who was unhappy that he had to constantly change clothes and hide his identity. But the warrior told him that it would be worse if he told everyone that the lich was hanging around here. He said that the church could become a problem in this case, but the Lord of the Dead replied that the church does not scare him. What was most important for the Furin was that as long as their agreement was in effect, the Lord of the Dead should not suffer. The lich felt defeated, and in general he did not like his role in these adventures at all. When the warrior spoke with the Lord of the Dead about how he needed to devour one person with his lich and bring him back to life. But at that moment the lich told him that this could not be compared with the creation of mindless walkers. After death, every life is doomed to oblivion. It was both a blessing and a curse. The villain added that the warrior risks getting into trouble by violating this order. Was Furin really ready to do this just to resurrect his once best friend in the form of a creature whom the whole world curses? Without thinking about it for very long, the warrior said that he didn't care about all this, since he was doing all these machinations just to find the sword. In fact, he needs this lich because this old friend of his was the keeper of the holy sword. This means that if he is resurrected, he will be able to tell exactly where this sword is. Therefore, Furin asked the Lord of the Dead for help. When the villain said that he would think about this proposal, he saw that the muscles and veins on the warrior's arm became very tense. After a moment they shook hands, and Lich said that they should make an agreement. Then he added that since the warrior was already planning to create a lich, he should find out that the body of the deceased would need to be carefully prepared. The heart of a dead man is needed, which will form the basis of the sacrifice. An eye searching for souls and half a pork carcass. Then the lich said that the pork carcass might not even be needed, and the warrior interrupted, adding that he didn't understand anything, so it was better for him to just tell him where to go. And so it happened, and it was in this way that Furin, together with the Lord of the Dead, now found themselves alone in the forest. They walked another short distance, and a smile appeared on the lich's face when he realized that they were now at their destination. In front of them was an ancient forest, which people in some settlements often called the Elven Garden. The man decided to ask again whether the essence of the forest is really located here. Then the Lord replied that the resurrection of the dead requires payment. In other words, this requires a sacrifice. And if you need to bring back a common man, then a pig will do. But it's just that the guy was a great wizard, then the sacrifice should be much more significant. Up to this point, everything was clear, but still Herkina could not understand one detail. Why is all this happening together, where his very old friend lives, whom they have not seen for a long time? A small group of soldiers occupied not the most obvious shelters and waited for their target. They behaved as quietly as possible and watched the target in order to attack it at the most opportune moment. Some of them were incredibly scared, as very quickly the target approached almost point blank to their positions. When one of the soldiers said that there was a bear in front of them, the second answered him that this was not just a beast, but a real guardian of the forest. And today they received the task to pacify this guard and kill him right on the spot. Then the second warrior shouted that in this case it was necessary to attack, but his comrade did not entirely agree with this tactic. At first he thought it was a joke, but it turned out that it was not, and he was very scared when the soldier with the sword in his hands ran away from the bushes. As soon as he ran up to the bear, he immediately struck him, and heard a very loud sound characteristic of metal. It was the sound of a sword hitting some iron object, and when the soldier lowered his head, he saw that the sword shattered into two parts. Now he had no weapon, and now the guardian of the forest noticed his presence behind him. The animal did not think too much and immediately struck the enemy with its powerful and huge paw. An instant, and the body of this bandit is already lying on the floor and does not show any signs of life. The bear noticed that in addition to this enemy, there were several more similar enemies nearby. The commander of the soldiers was scared because the beast was now furious, and his subordinate said that there was no other way out, and he needed to defend himself with all his might. But suddenly someone put their hand on this subordinate's shoulder and began to come closer. It was a man in a hood who said that further victims would definitely be useless. He looked at the bear and said in a quiet voice that he himself would deal with this problem right now. The soldiers did not know who he was, and only one of them had ever heard of this man, and he was glad to finally see his power with his own eyes. It was none other than the wizard Adal, about whom there were legends in the nearby settlements. The bear behaved as such animals usually behave in this situation. He was extremely careful. His movements were very slow, and the wizard's movement was non-existent as he simply stood still and watched. The two soldiers were talking to each other, and one of them noticed that the atmosphere had changed with the mere appearance of this wizard. After a few seconds of the bear walking from one side to the other, the wizard suddenly raised his hand and pointed it forward. After that, he made a gesture with his hand, which meant inviting the bear and calling it closer to him. The soldiers were very happy and surprised when they realized that the wizard had just tried to taunt such a strong opponent. When this happened, the bear again fell into a rage and began to run towards the enemy in order to tear him apart with his powerful paws. But it seems that the wizard was ready for this, since he took a fighting stance a second before the bear had already approached his body. A moment, and the bear swung his paw in the direction of the enemy, and Adal did not even budge. There was a blow, but the wizard quite easily managed to dodge it by moving his body to the left. Because the bear was very large and heavy, it was very difficult for him to move quickly, so Adal took advantage of this and hit the bear in the liver. The soldiers began to scream even louder, because they could not believe that the wizard managed to hit the bear in the liver, near which the thickness of the skin was 10 centimeters. But it won't be possible to kill the bear with just one blow, so Adal again dodged the bear's counterattack and prepared for a new attack. When his opponent was open, he used a kick directly to the head, and this time the damage from the kick was much more impressive. Medvedev was already on his feet with great effort, but was still conscious and could fight. Adal had much more strength and consciousness in his head and body, so he removed the block and swung his fist to finish off the enemy. The bear was able to withstand this blow quite easily, as he blocked it, and his body shifted slightly to the side. A counterattack was launched, and the bear again delivered a standard blow to the enemy's body, but this time Adal did not have time to dodge. Perhaps it was even better, since now he did not dodge, but stood in a block, thereby swallowing all the energy. His body moved, but he still stood in the same position and looked at the enemy. One soldier said that he thought that such a beast would not be an easy opponent, and the second added that he still had not seen anything magical from this mage. Then his friend said that he is blind if he does not see magic. A man who fights on equal terms with a bear with his bare hands is magic. While they were talking about this, Duel took out a small stick that was on his back and prepared to attack the angry bear. Meanwhile, Furin and the Lord of the Dead were still in the forest, and the warrior was going to tell him something. He notified the lich that they were entering the lands of the forest dwellers, and from now on it was worth keeping an eye out. They continued moving, and after some time the Lord of the Dead said that there are many elves here, and it is only a matter of time before these short people shoot an arrow at them. But the man answered him that it was not only about the arrows of the guardians. The owner in the forest has a truly bad temper, and therefore I would not want to catch their eye. The lich relaxed and told the warrior that he knew one example of a truly bad character, a person who destroys anything without hitting. At that moment, a realization came to his mind, and he instantly shut up and just stared into space. When the man began to walk further, the villain became very frightened and took a defensive stance. But it seems that everything worked out fine, and the warrior simply continued to walk straight, not even paying attention to the Lord of the Dead. When they walked another short distance, the man noticed that the forest in front of them was almost completely destroyed. The villain looked at this and suggested that giant beavers must have been here. But the man answered him that forest dwellers do not do such things. Just as the warrior wanted to say that he seemed to understand who was the culprit of all this, a spear flew into the ground at high speed. After this, one could hear the loud sound that the horse made as it ran closer and closer to the couple. The soldiers took a combat stance the moment they came close enough to the Furin and began to wait for the order. The commander of this small unit was on the horse, and then the warrior said what could only people do with this forest. As far as he knew, the guardians of the forest and the humans were at war. Have the forces really changed that much? The commander ordered those of yours to stop, since otherwise resistance would be punished. He also added that their unit is called Warang. The Lord of the Dead immediately asked this commander if he knew who he was, and the commander answered him that he would like to find out right now. The lich wanted to answer something, but Furin interrupted him, and said that they were just wanderers passing by. But he also could not resist saying that as far as he knows, this place is the land of the guardians of the forest. The commander was silent for a while, after which he said that they had arrived on the orders of His Majesty the Emperor to push back the forest barbarians and return the land of their ancestors. This forest became the epicenter of a conquest mission, and the commander said that most likely these two know what happens when civilians enter a combat zone. He raised his hand and notified the warrior that if he did not turn back now, they would act in accordance with martial law. Purple energy began to circulate around the Lord of the Dead, and this continued until the man ordered him to finish. In a quiet voice he told him that the extra noise was unnecessary, and in a louder voice he told the commander that they were returning, and recommended that he continue to do his job. They had almost gone into the bushes, but at the very last moment the commander who was sitting on his horse turned to the Lord of the Dead. He said that he looked like the bandit they had been looking for a long time, and so he needed to see his face. The Lord of the Dead could no longer endure it, and asked the warrior if he could now kill them all. The man needed to think a little, because he realized that the King of People had nevertheless invaded the lands of the Guardians of the Forest, and this annoyed him. One of the soldiers who was standing right next to the commander suddenly pointed towards one of the bushes and advised him to look there. There lay the corpse of a bear, and the commander very quickly noticed that the size of this bear was much larger than usual. He looked up and saw that a small group of people was standing near the corpse of this bear. In front of this entire group stood the wizard Adal, who rubbed his hands and said that the mission was now completed. The commander couldn't believe that the wizard really managed to take down this monster, but he only said that it was his duty. This was not so surprising, considering that there were rumors that Adal had once killed an ogre with his bare hands. He replied that you shouldn't expect anything else from the magician, since performing any task, as if by magic, is the essence of a magician. While they were talking, the warrior decided to come closer to the lifeless body of the bear in order to examine it. He realized that this creature was well suited to be the object they were looking for, and the warrior also realized that it seemed that this wizard was really powerful. While Furin was thinking about this, two soldiers approached him point blank and put their spears right in front of his face. Then the commander said that it looked like this man was completely out of his mind, and said that he had a chance to leave on good terms. Raising his voice, the commander of the troops said that in accordance with martial law, he would be immediately executed on the spot. Also create a short pause, after which the commander ordered him to say his last word. For some time the strong Furin did not say anything, but then he said only one word. At that very moment the arrow pierced the body of the commander who was sitting on the horse almost right through. A moment later, several more arrows flew at the soldiers who stood near the horse, and did not even understand where the enemy was. The soldiers were completely helpless in this situation, since there was no shelter or additional troops nearby. Those who survived began to shout that this was a real ambush, and they needed to take formation. These were elves, and the girl who was their commander ordered her subordinates not to leave alive. The elf looked towards the last surviving soldiers and pathetically said that those who set foot in their forest should become fertilizer for its trees. These words were an order, and the elves who were around instantly reacted and fired the first volley of arrows at the enemy. The soldiers had no choice but to try to dodge the arrows that flew into their bodies at incredibly high speed. It is worth noting that the soldiers also had mages who stood closer to the commander in order to protect him. They created an impenetrable field and supported it with the help of their energy, and then one of the magicians asked the commander if he was okay. He said that he had let his guard down, and also added that he could not believe that the elven bastards had been sitting in ambush and waiting all this time. He began to urge on his horse, and ordered the magicians to continue to hold the defense while he called for help. The enemies were breaking through, and it was very difficult for the magician and the rest of the soldiers to maintain the defense for so long. Furin, meanwhile, simply watched everything that was happening, until he heard a suspicious sound behind his back. It was an arrow flying past, and while dodging, the warrior condemned the commander's decision to abandon his soldiers. Several more arrows flew in his direction, but the strong Furin was able to dodge without much effort, and advised the soldiers to dodge too. Then the Lord of the Dead asked the warrior when he could kill everyone who is here, but the Furin advised him to just start evading. For example, he decided to bring the wizard Adal, who, with the help of some kind of stick, very quickly deflected arrows flying at him. Moreover, he was even quite successful in stopping these arrows with his bare hands, when they were already almost near his body, and he could even break arrows with just one movement of his hand, thereby adding pathos to his person. The first of the 4 commanders of the Dark Lord said that this warrior was really good, and then Furin added that he reminded him of him in his youth. Suddenly, Adal raised his hands and said that he was surrendering, since he was an ordinary mercenary. Someone came closer to him, and said that he couldn't just give up in the situation in which this mercenary now found himself. It seems that it was an elf who took off her mask and said that only death awaits those who incur the wrath of the forest. The Lord of the Dead, who saw who was now in front of him, was surprised that he and the driver managed to find a real dark elf. In a very loud voice he decided to ask the girl what the dark elf forgot here, but she was not particularly happy with this wording. She started screaming and saying that this hooded stranger is just a racist, and for this he needs to be executed now. Firkin approached her, and said that he suggested ending it here. It was very unpleasant to realize that the enemy was able to get so close to you so unnoticed. A few seconds later, the warrior said that the girl had everything written all over her face, and when she didn't answer, he asked if she remembered him. He said that he played with her and gave her piggyback rides when she was still very little, and these were very pleasant memories. The girl was incredibly angry at this, and she fired a shot from her bow, at the same time shouting that the human old man did not dare to mock her. With just one movement of his hand he deflected this arrow, and said that it was better for them to just talk calmly first. But the elf was not ready for this, and added that she had nothing to discuss with the vile human degenerate. She didn't like the fact that all these strangers broke the non-aggression pact and invaded these lands, since she knew people only from the point of view that all they did was destroy the forest and exterminate her relatives. Firkin listened to all this, and then made a small push, saying that it looked like he would have to achieve a conversation in a different way. With the help of this somersault, he moved close to the body of the bear, which lay on the ground and did not even move. He used some kind of technique on his body, and then said that he ordered him to return to his true form, calling him by the name Druid Gom. It quickly became obvious to everyone around that this bear was in fact a human. The elf prepared another arrow and ordered the warrior to remove his dirty hands from the bear's body. But in response, Firkin only laughed, because he understood that now he was in a winning situation. In one motion, he lifted this druid by the neck and said that from now on they need to sit down at the negotiating table. After a few seconds, the elf noticed that the druid gom was indeed in the hands of this warrior. The warrior's voice became more serious, and he said that if the elves do not want to lose their precious sir, then they need to pay attention to the following. But the man never finished saying this, as the elf fired an explosive arrow at him. When the explosion began to disappear, the elf told her subordinates that they would not negotiate with the invaders. Even before all the dust had settled after the explosion, the strong Firkin decided to turn to the elves. He said that he was surprised that the girl behaved so unreasonably, since Sir Gom almost died after this. It was not clear how the mana arrow could not eliminate some wanderer from the forest who was simply standing still. The Lord of the Dead turned to the Firkin, and called him the Lich King. But he did it so quietly that only the warrior could hear him. Now the strong Firkin looked at his opponents with completely different eyes, and said that they simply had terrible manners, so they should be corrected a little. The elves did not want to listen to him, so they immediately sent several of their most powerful arrows at him. This time the Lord of the Dead had a chance to show himself, so he created impenetrable energy protection around himself and the warrior. Then, when all the arrows were destroyed on the impenetrable shield, he used the second technique and placed his hand on the cold ground. At the same moment, all the killed soldiers began to get up, and the Lord of the Dead added that they all needed to get together, since now their task was to teach the elves good manners. The action moved to an outpost of an army of people who were located not so far from the previous scene of events. In the tent, which was the largest compared to all the others, there was now a very loud scream that came from the general. This was due to the fact that someone came into his tent, and for this reason he was already angry. But when he saw that his subordinate had brought a zebra, he immediately laughed and said that he liked such curiosities. The subordinates and the zebra went inside, and the general suddenly noticed that he had another visitor, who seemed to be seriously injured. It was the commander of that small unit who reported to his general that they had fallen into a trap. The commander also admitted that his act was shameful, and added that while interrogating suspicious people, they were suddenly surrounded. The general was most interested in these suspicious people, and so the commander gave more information, saying that it was an old man and a strange hooded bandit. It was necessary to think a little about this information, since he had been looking for such strangers for a very long time. He turned his head towards one of the warriors who was in the tent, asking if he was looking for them by chance. Orn, quite famous in these parts. The commander immediately noticed his snow-white armor, and realized that he was from the army, that he was subordinate to the king from the first order of knighthood. And this sir decided to ask the commander if this old man had blonde hair, blue eyes and a scar all over his face. He replied that that was how it all happened, and added that this old man was a little creepy, but most likely he was already dead, since the elves would kill everyone there. Sir Orn began to leave the tent, and in a quiet voice added to the commander that if this is who he is looking for, then most likely the elves are dead. The general could not believe that the target that Sir was looking for was so strong that the First Order of Knighthood was looking for him. He said that if the general finds out more, he cannot guarantee that he will remain alive in the end. Because the less you know, the better you sleep. Now Orn had a new task, and he turned to the commander to help him complete this task. Namely, this warrior wanted the commander to take him exactly to the place where he saw the old man for the last time. Now the action moved to the Temple of the Guardians of the Forest, which was located right at the foot of the Udan tree. In the secret room there were several elves who were performing the sacrament that elves do in difficult times. There were 3 high elves here, and 1 elder. It quickly became clear to all of them that the source of the Udan would reveal danger that threatened their forest. The elder could see this very well, and energy radiated from his eyes, since thanks to this technique he could look further than all other mortals. But it seems that the elder saw something other than the high elves, since in the vessel through which you can see people, there was one of his subordinates, who fell asleep in the kitchen. When the high elves showed the elder where to look, he saw that the people had grabbed Gamma and Darnam. However, they also added that it was not the man from the Steel Empire who captured them. This was someone who remained in the shadows for a long time. The elves were glad that Furkin the Strong finally showed himself to this world. The field after the battle really looked terrible, and the green grass was covered in fresh blood. There was a smell of death in the air, and this smell was so strong that one could easily understand that the massacre had happened quite recently. Orn and the commander looked at all this and were silent, not even really talking to each other. The commander said that as far as he understood, his soldiers lost the battle, and the intruders managed to escape along with the elves. At that moment, the Orn bowed his knee to the ground in order to taste it. When he swallowed this piece of earth, he immediately felt an incredible pain inside his head. Then it became clear that this was dark magic, and he had no doubt that this was it. This was obvious from the fact that the earth was desecrated by black magic. Namely, black magic tends to pollute the environment. The commander suggested that it seemed that the old man was a dark magician, but Orn told him that in fact this was not the case, since that grandfather is a hero who, like all other heroes, rarely worries about his appearance. When Orn began to tell him about this hero, the commander heard the phrase Holy Sword, and realized that it looked like this old man was a warrior. The commander should not have said this favor out loud, since Orn had already made his decision when he heard all these guesses. With just one movement of his sword, he made a horizontal blow to the commander's neck, and blood immediately gushed out. He also added that the commander did his job well and was able to show the way well. With the last of his strength, the commander said that he did not raise why he killed him if Orn himself told all this. He realized that the warrior returned alive alone, and it already happened that he hated such nonentities. But it also seems that the rumors he heard about the warrior teaming up with the Ghost King turned out to be true. The only thing that was not clear to Sir now was how low the strong Furkin was ready to fall in order to achieve his goal. Meanwhile, the action had shifted, and now the warrior and the Lord of the Dead were moving through the forest along with the prisoners who were in a ghostly cage. The elf constantly screamed and ordered the driver to fight her right now, and not stand with his back to her. The warrior could not tolerate this for long, so he decided to ask the Lord of the Dead if he knew any spell that could shut up a person. He just laughed, and said that it looks like the Furkin is very noble and fair, since he doesn't kill these annoying captives. But Furkin answered him that this elf was his niece, so he should be gentle with her. However, his goals were much more selfish, as the warrior planned to use her as a trump to gain the essence of the forest. Everyone knows that the essence of the forest is a real storehouse of mysteries. His power is so great that the Guardians have cherished it like the apple of their eye since the time of their ancestors. And therefore, to obtain the essence of the forest, it will be possible to threaten the death of the elves, and in this way get what you want. The elf heard these words of the warrior, and shouted something to him, but he replied that the girl seemed to have a lack of manners, since she decided to interrupt the adults. Now that the mercenary also knew the motive of all these people, he decided to ask them why, in this case, they did not let him go, because he simply watched everything that was happening from the side, and it turned out that it was not particularly fair to him. Then Furkin answered him that, unfortunately for him, the barrier cannot be thrown without cancelling the spell, so he will have to wait for the end of the negotiations. The elf said that the warrior is very mistaken if he really thinks that the owner of the forest will simply take the essence and transfer it to him. since this essence is the basis of the ancient forest, and their divine heritage. This is not something that the outsider has the right to even discuss. The man said that he knew little about it, but added that all elves had better pray that everything goes smoothly, because otherwise, he will destroy the entire forest to the last tree and still steal the essence. The elf again became very aggressive, and said that these were very loud words since in front of her was just a decrepit old man. But Druid Gom suddenly woke up and said that it looked like this man was not bluffing, since he was none other than the strong warrior Furin. Now he was a little better, and he could tell everyone who was in this cell information that they did not yet know. And I couldn't believe that the old rude, complete hooligan, looking like a beggar, was the same hero. Gom confirmed these words, and said that this complete hooligan is really a warrior, who disappeared with the holy sword 30 years ago. The elf remembered those moments when in her early childhood someone rode her on his shoulders, and it looked like it was a Furin. The druid suddenly fell to his knees and told the warrior that he should have immediately recognized his brother in arms and the great hero. Bowing his body completely, he greeted the great warrior. Furin noted that this was too much, and the Lord of the Dead added that usually those who try to deceive you do this. The elf asked Gom to rise up and not bow down to this old man, but the druid only asked his old friend why he came here. Moreover, he was wondering where the warrior was all this time, and why he disappeared when another disaster struck the world. As the Dark Lord's remaining forces continued to pose a threat, those who had once been blood allies turned spears and swords against each other. Gom said that this led to consequences that Furin himself sees. And since the human king, the one who used to be a brother, did something irreparable to the sacred forest, he asked the warrior if he really did not hear the cry of all the trees, and did not feel the bitterness of the loss of countless brothers and sisters whom people killed. After all, a warrior could have prevented all this, and not just looked at it all from the side. The druid's voice became even louder, and he shouted to the Furin that he must stop this bloody war. After thinking a little, the warrior said that he was refusing this. There was real shock on Gom's face. The man began to walk away from the cage and said that all he wanted from this place was the essence of the forest, and added that he was sorry that such a situation had happened. Then Gom said that a warrior should not behave like that, but Furin told him that a lot of water had passed under the bridge since he renounced this title. The man felt in his nature that if he did not interfere, then it would be another thorn in his body. The elf told Gom that this warrior is real trash, and moreover, it was probably he who created this barrier. Furin was tired of talking and he notified everyone that the conversation was over, and also warned that if they continued to make noise, he would shut their mouths with a spell. The group continued walking until the warriors suddenly stopped in the middle of the road. When this happened, the Lord of the Dead noticed this and decided to ask his boss why he suddenly stopped. At the same moment, an object flew straight at the Lord at high speed. The warrior noticed that it looks like these are nothing more than tree roots that someone controls in order to attack. Awareness was not enough, since it was still necessary to very quickly evade these attacks by moving your body in space. These blows were repeated over and over again, until the warrior retreated enough for them not to reach him. Standing with his back to the Lord of the Dead, he asked him if everything was okay with the barrier. Then he turned his head and saw that a hole had appeared in the barrier, which was created with the help of those very roots. Furin realized that most likely the elves could not go far, and therefore the Lord should go in pursuit right now. Still, he had not seen his old friend for a long time, whom he only now noticed sitting on a branch of one of the trees. This was one of the most important elves who could live in this forest, and his gaze was as focused and serious as possible, since it looked like he was ready to fight with the warrior. Taking off his outerwear, Furin asked if he had really come all the way, worrying about his daughter, while the warrior himself just wanted to visit them. He began to stretch his hands and said that it looked like they, as old friends, should catch up. Huge roots from forest trees flew in different directions and burst out from under the earth. Even taking into account the fact that he had a ghostly weapon with him, it was very difficult for the Lord of the Dead to cut all these roots. Most likely not because they were particularly strong, but because they were very fast, and there were a lot of them. The warrior, in turn, focused all his strength and concentrated on the body in order to inflict maximum damage on the enemy. He constantly struck with his fists, and with just one movement he could cut a root in half. While he was doing this, he gave the order to the Lord of the Dead to ignore the roots and immediately go to catch the escaped elves. Firkin didn't look like he had just ripped apart wooden roots with his bare hands. His gaze was completely calm. The first of the 4 commanders of the Dark Lord said that he would carry out this order no matter what. Then the warrior looked at him, and warned him that it was better not to even think about escaping, otherwise he would go after him, and not after the holy sword. But he said that he didn't even have to worry, because the Lord of the Dead himself wanted to reap the warrior's soul. Using one of the techniques, he dissolved his body in the air, and Firkin quietly whispered, wishing not to die a boring death in this forest. At that second the man thought, because after this phrase it was difficult to maintain trust in this creature. But still, you had to not focus on some of your thoughts, but look at the problem that is literally in front of you. It was the elder of the forest, and the warrior told him that it seemed like they should now have a private chat. When the elder got close enough to his opponent, he was very tense. He began to list all the nicknames that Firkin was called. Dragon Killer, Bringing Light, Unceremonious Devil. The elder also added that now the man is completely unrecognizable, and he no longer looks like the warrior he knew before. In his opinion, the warrior looked much uglier now, and had aged greatly since their last meeting. He didn't like his sloppy beard and torn clothes, and so he said to his old friend's face that he was rather the strongest of the homeless ragamuffins. Then the warrior silently began to warm up, and then said that this was too much, and you shouldn't say that to a friend you haven't seen for 30 years. The elf said that he is no longer just an elder, but a great elder who is the owner of this forest. This made the man laugh, and he decided to congratulate him on such a significant promotion. Then the elves swung their weapon, which looked like a large head, and hit the place where the warrior was. These blows continued, and the elf found time to shout something towards the driver, forcing him to speak more respectfully. The warrior very quickly noticed that Elfa was now speaking as if he were an old man, and there was absolutely nothing interesting in his words. He prepared to strike the enemy, but roots that suddenly emerged from the ground grabbed his limb. He swung his mace in the opposite direction, and now the Firkin had no chance to come back. These are attacks. Therefore, after the head touched his body, he flew away at high speed and began to lie on the earth. The elf summoned even more roots, and said that the Firkin was stupid if, after disappearing for about 30 years, he attacked the guardians of the forest. And moreover, he dared to bring a dirty dark magician to this sacred place. At the same time, he directed a huge root directly into the warrior's body so that he would tear it apart from the inside. Well, the man grabbed this root with his own hands and managed to stop it, while shouting to the elf that he had an interesting fact for him. Namely, that the first to attack him were the guardians of the forest. Taking the root in his hands, he hit the elf with it, and he had to retreat a little and try to slow down with his legs. The warrior ran up to strike the enemy, and at the same time shouted, "What then? What now? Absolutely nothing has changed, not even the skills of the elder of the forest." This blow could have easily killed the elf if he had not blocked it with his weapon. Taking the blow, he told the warrior that he did not believe that he had returned here solely for the sake of fighting. The man had no intention of responding to this, but instead decided to tighten his grip on his opponent's weapon. Then he shouted that he did not have the slightest interest in their war with people, and he came here solely for the essence of the forest. When the elf heard this phrase, for literally a few seconds he could not even regain consciousness. Everything around seemed to begin to float, and for this reason, the warrior took advantage of the moment, and launched a kick at the enemy. The elf had to step back a little and grab his stomach, which had just survived an incredibly strong blow. Now the elder's weapon was in Firkin's hands, and he said that he knew well that the elves kept this artifact for a very long time. He promised that as soon as he used this item, he would immediately return it to the hands of Udan. The elf was a little silent at first, and then said that it seemed that the warrior had become completely stupid with age. With one movement of his hand, he summoned several more roots from the ground, which raised his body to a small height. It is obvious that he will be against handing over the artifact to Firkin, so he said that he wanted to resolve everything peacefully, but it seems that it will not come to that. He once again asked the elf to deal with all this without unnecessary hassle and sacrifice. In a quiet voice, the elder of the forest said that of course he would share, and a glimmer of hope already appeared in the man's eyes. But after another moment, the elf sent a huge pile of roots straight at his opponent, which would tear him apart any minute. But Firkin only raised his head and said that he expected that it would not be possible to reach an agreement with words. His speed became very impressive, and he began to climb up those roots, getting closer and closer to his opponent. The elf became incredibly angry, and shouted at his enemy, asking why he even needed the essence of the forest, since this is something that he cannot give to anyone, under any circumstances. After all, this object is sacred. In this case, the man had to announce to his opponent why he needed this item. While the elf was accumulating his energy that came from his hands, the warrior said that he needed him in order to revive someone. In order not to receive very strong and significant damage, the man used his opponent's weapon to push off from the root. A moment later, he was already above the head of his opponent, and the elf could not understand where he had gone, since it happened quite quickly. He raised his head up to see where the enemy was, but there was no one there. Furin, meanwhile, said that he wants to revive the one who was their support many years ago. Another movement was noticeable in the air, and then the elf realized that it seemed that his opponent was a little faster than himself. Now in front of his face was a warrior who swung his leg to strike the elf on the head. The picture immediately appeared before the warrior's eyes when he was holding the bloody body of his brother, and could not believe what was happening. This very picture was before the eyes of the elf, but for him it was already too late. Suddenly, a small root appeared in this elf's hand, which had several energy veins. The action had shifted, and it seemed that the real elder of the forest was now in his hideout. He didn't understand what Furin the Strong was trying to achieve, and why he wanted to get the artifact so badly. In the place where the battle was currently taking place, the entire body of the forest elder was covered with roots, and this greatly surprised the man. He simply watched this silently for a while until his opponent's body shattered into several small pieces. This was very similar to the root clone technique that his forest elder often used directly in battle. The warrior realized that he could exhale a little, and realized that, like after any other fierce battle, only now clarity came to his head. The understanding came that it seemed he had gone too far, and promised himself that after he brought him back to life and turned him into a lich, he would immediately think about the consequences. The man even stopped for a while, as he thought about the Lord of the Dead, who should have already caught the escapees. He's the Phantom King, he shouldn't have a problem with that. But it turned out that some situations are actually much more dangerous than they initially seem. The man continued on his way, and after some time he noticed a very interesting thing just on the floor. It looked like some kind of trap, and he immediately stopped his walking when he noticed it. This trap was similar to the magic circle with a reverse mana release limitation. This trap was dug using tree roots to make it harder to notice. The more mana spent inside it, the more is released in the opposite direction, imposing restrictions on the one who stepped on it. But this trap was not alone here. There was also a more cunning system that works much more often. This is just a simple steel wire that has been threaded from tree to tree, and is actually quite easy to spot. But she was also thoroughly coated with a neuroparalytic, a signature move of the forest guardian. This toxin is so poisonous that even a giant will fall from just one scratch that contains this substance. But what was most interesting was that the Phantom King himself fell for these rather cheap tricks. It was really surprising, and the man even thought that this was not the Phantom King, but at most the Phantom Count. It seems that there was no other choice now, and since everything turned out this way, then we need to resort to what the warrior did not want to do. Namely, this meant that he would just have to break through with a fight and get what he needed. He looked around and realized in which direction he needed to move, but before that he needed to warm up a little. An instant, and the warrior headed in that direction, and a wave of dust from the earth and air moved in the opposite direction. Orn, who had been sitting on a branch all this time and watching his target, covered his face with his hands so that dust would not get there. There was a smile on his face, as he realized that finally the warrior had been found, and the matter could be completed. The action moved to the forest guardian shrine, specifically at the foot of a tree called Udan. This settlement also had an underground prison, which was called the Root Prison among the locals. It was very dark here, and only those guards who took a torch with them could see something around. One of the guards brought the Lord of the Dead, and immediately threw him into prison. When leaving, he called the new prisoner a dark magician, but he was offended, since he is the Lord of the Dead. He immediately took his place and began to think about what to do next, until he heard someone's voice on the side. It was the voice of a prisoner from the next cell who said that he thought that 7 times reborn would look a little different. Then he did not turn his head to the prisoner in order to ask who he was and where he heard about him. He said that he was pleased to meet you, and introduced himself by the name Adal. He knew about the Lord of the Dead from his teacher, who had been with him most of his life. Now the Lord of the Dead realized that in front of him was the same mercenary who had been so foolishly captured, and who seemed to have been captured once again. The Lord of the Dead decided to play a little joke, and said that the guy just needs to learn to say no when he is offered to be captured. It was interesting that teacher Adal knew about the Lord of the Dead, since perhaps he is an academician, or simply a dark magician. The mercenary replied that he knew very little about the teacher, since he had quite a lot of skeletons in his closet, but he knew one fact about him for sure. So this is that before his teacher was a real lich. The Lord of the Dead said that he had never heard of one of the 12 liches training a person, let alone a simple soldier who was not even a dark magician. The mercenary said that he was a magician, and despite the fact that the Lord of the Dead did not believe him, he tried to prove the opposite. Moreover, the mercenary still had something to surprise the Lord of the Dead, since he said that his teacher was the 13th lich. The first of the 4 commanders of the Dark Lord was very surprised, since according to his information, liches did not appear after 12. For the mercenary, it didn't matter whether they believed him or not, since he said this information in order to manipulate, and under the pretext of telling more, invite the Lord of the Dead to help him escape. He replied that the idea sounds good, but the problem is the shackles that are on their hands. The more mana the caster uses, the more it is released in the opposite direction, binding them even further. That is why, if you apply your maximum magical energy to these opcavs, they will make you even worse. When the Lord of the Dead saw that the mercenary was trying to destroy them, he said that there was no need to try to break them apart with brute force. He tried to say something else, but he was interrupted by the sound of the chain that held these handcuffs, preventing them from falling apart. The Lord immediately fell into shock when he realized that this mercenary could not emit mana because of the shackles, and it seems that he simply broke them through physical force. But he said that he was a magician, and not someone who uses his physical strength in battles. The mercenary exhaled and asked the Lord of the Dead if the answer he had already heard would suit him. He replied that it was too early, so the plan was to wait for the right moment and destroy the gate and then escape. This plan was really good, but the Lord of the Dead told the mercenary that he wouldn't be stuck here too without some kind of plan. His plan was to simply wait for the warrior's plan to play out. Therefore, he advised his neighbor simply not to waste his energy, since the plan that the Lord of the Dead proposes is much more effective. As soon as he finished this sentence, rock immediately began to fall from the ceiling. All the guards who were in the dungeon began to run away and raise the alarm, shouting that they were being attacked. The Lord of the Dead, without turning his head towards his neighbor, said that it seemed that this moment, which he had spoken about earlier, had just arrived. The guards tried to gather near the main entrance, and the guards said that they did not see people, but only one person. It was not clear why such a serious alarm was raised only because of one person, but everyone thought so only until a certain time, namely until some old man hit the main wall of the castle a couple of times. After a few blows, the wall crumbled, and the warrior very loudly asked the sentries to call the manager here. All the guards who were on the wall could not believe that the outer walls broke after a couple of blows, but nevertheless, they were ready to fight to the last drop of blood, and therefore drew their swords. The man asked them not to be nervous, and simply said that he wanted to talk to their boss. Moreover, he didn't like that the doors weren't opened for him right away, so he knocked out the wall. A few seconds later, Firkin saw an old friend in front of him, who said that the warrior was still just as stubborn. Next to him was an elfin Gam, who looked at the warrior with anger and focus. The man said that they had settled well here, and then said that they needed to resolve their misunderstanding right now. But he didn't even have time to agree on this, since the elder of the forest immediately tried to strike the enemy with his weapon. He didn't do it very well, so he simply looked at the warrior with an indifferent gaze in order to hear his words and motivation. It turned out that at the very last moment the strong one was able to block this blow, and therefore the mace did not destroy his head. He looked straight into the eyes of the main elf, and asked if it was really in their family to attack someone just in the middle of a conversation. He said that the warrior not only teamed up with the ghostly king, but also came to their sacred forest to wreak havoc. So they have nothing to talk about. The man realized that he needed to explain a lot of things in order for the elder of the forest to finally understand everything. He put her hand on his shoulder and said that it looked like they needed to talk now, and it was very important. He really needed the essence of the forest, exactly like the Phantom Count, to achieve one goal. The elder of the forest said that he could not do this, since these were very sacred and important artifacts for his people. The warrior replied that he had already heard similar phrases, but still there is something that is more important than the lives of the guardians of the forest. When the subordinates heard this, they immediately shouted to the elder of the forest to come to his senses and kill the intruder right away. He immediately realized this, and again swung his huge weapon to hit the warrior on the head. But he blocked this blow, instantly moving towards him and holding him forward in his hands. But what was strange was that several guards who were standing near the forest elder were instantly killed. The elder asked what kind of tricks these were. Then the strong Furin replied that it was not him, and they suddenly heard a voice from the fog. It was Sir Orn who notified the warrior that he had business with him. He was a little surprised when he heard this, and asked what he needed, and whether it could wait a little. He also asked if he came alone, but he, without removing the smile from his face, said that he would not dare to come here alone, since, of course, he had to show respect and come at once with his entire retinue. This was the first order of knighthood, and the elder of the forest thought that the human king seemed to want to put an end to all this. A brilliant plan appeared in the warrior's head, and without thinking twice he decided to once again ask the elder of the forest for the essence. But now he had a deal on offer. All Udan had to do was simply give up this very essence, and in return the warrior would deal with these little people for him. The action had shifted, and now the general was playing chess with one of his close people. It was very nice that he constantly won, but most likely it was due to the fact that they simply gave in to him. This friend said that it seemed that the confrontation with the elven degenerates had revealed some special talents in him. He answered him that he would not call it talents, but perhaps he learned something, due to the fact that this war has been going on for 3 years and its end is near. A friend said that he had heard that even the First Order of Knighthood had joined the battle. The general was, to put it mildly, surprised that there were already rumors about this. In any case, it had to be said that what the First Order did not do would be to its advantage. A friend asked what the general was doing then, leisurely chilling in this camp. After all, it would be possible to send all the troops after and resolve the issue in a day. He decided to answer him, and said that his friend had a hard time understanding who they were talking about. This was the First Order of Knighthood, a knightly order directly subordinate to the Emperor. Masters of sword and magic, each of whom is stronger than 1,000 warriors. The general continued to tell this, despite the fact that his friend said that he was aware. The members of this squad are extremely secretive, and little is known about them. So now the general and the rest of the soldiers can only wait and enjoy their vacation, since they intervened, everything will only get more interesting. Namely, that the outcome of this war has now become as obvious as the fact that the brushwood will inevitably burn out in the fire. Meanwhile, the battle began, and it began with the druid Gom turning into a bear and attacking the first enemy. This opponent was one of the members of the order, who stood unshakably in place for some time. Then, at the very last moment, he placed his shield directly in front of his body, thereby protecting himself from the bear's blow. When he hit the bill, he immediately broke several thin bones in his paw. The elf understood that she needed to attack as soon as possible, so she took up her bow and ordered her subordinates to strike together. Despite their best efforts, one of the order members used a protective shield that prevented arrows or enemies from passing through. He constantly maintained the energy of this shield, not giving opponents any chance to advance. After some time, the elf said that she was already tired of this guy constantly repelling their attacks, and that she was on the verge of a breakdown now. When the shield disappeared, everyone realized that the mages from the order were preparing something very powerful. But it seems that their leader also has an ace up his sleeve, which he is ready to use right now. Namely, the elder of the forest used the call of the Udan tree, which this world has not seen for a very long time. One of those who was a member of the order came forward, as she decided to take this obstacle only upon herself. Her sword movements were polished and very precise, and she looked at her opponent as if he was not several dozen times taller than her. Meanwhile, Orn spoke with the warrior, saying that he did not expect such strong resistance, and also added that he was wondering why the Furin decided to intervene. Then the man turned his head towards the battle, and said that he needed to deal with all these problems a little faster. He was also wondering why Orn was suddenly acting so friendly, despite the fact that he didn't even know him yet. Orn introduced himself and said his name, and also added that he was the deputy commander of the First Order of Knighthood, and also that he received an order from His Majesty the Emperor himself, and went in search of a warrior to escort him to him. The warrior suddenly became more embittered, and said that in the past he was a conductor of light, and therefore just anyone should definitely not accompany him. Moreover, he also added that right now he really wants to punch this guy right in the face, but he is restraining himself because the negotiations have not yet begun. He was suddenly interrupted by the Elder of the Forest, who said that Furin is a strong warrior, and therefore must help them. But he only said that he was interested in the essence. He said that this was very unexpected, but since he had a chance to fight such a strong opponent, then let it happen now. At the same moment, there was a small splash of air under this warrior's feet because he pushed off very hard before attacking. His sword cut the air, and the blade rushed right next to the warrior's beard. The blow was so strong that this sword knocked down the trees that were behind the Furin. Then the enemy swung his sword again and asked the legendary warrior at full speed. At that moment he wanted to see the strength of such a strong enemy, since in fact there were not many warriors equal in strength to Orn. After the subsequent blow, a small cut appeared on the man's face, and several drops of blood dripped from him. Then the warrior took the hand of his opponent, and prepared to tell him the following. He informed his opponent that he had a pretty good blade, and so he was wondering where he got it from. Furin had no shortage of strength at that moment, as he easily held Orn's hand. He told him that he would satisfy his curiosity, since he was so interested. It turns out that this sword could be summoned, since the second one immediately appeared in Orn's hand, and he said that he would show him the cellar if he defeated him. One more horizontal blow, and the Furin should already retreat, since it takes some time to gain strength. The warrior raised his head, as he realized that this enemy was not so simple, since his attacks could pierce his skin. Moreover, the enemy prepared himself and began to accumulate energy in his sword in order to strike again. He now had two swords, and he shouted very loudly to his opponent, warning him that he should get ready. An instant, and huge strips of energy flew towards Furin, at an incredibly high speed. The impact area was so large that the only thing the warrior could do was stand in the block. It was very difficult to contain it, because even by his very appearance, it was very clear that it was not very easy for him. When all the energy stopped, he quickly realized that his limbs were burning very terribly, and this was causing incredible discomfort. Moreover, an enemy also ran up close to him, with two swords at the ready, who shouted that it looked like the games were now over. But at the very last moment, Orn was unable to deliver this blow, for a reason that he could not have predicted. Namely, that a strong Furin will be able to step aside in less than half a second, and he won't even notice it. His gaze was very gloomy and serious, although a few minutes ago he still looked quite normal. A smile appeared on his face again, and he said that this search was just a killer aura, and in fact he was impressed. An idea came to his mind, and he immediately told the driver that if he did not intend to fight seriously, then perhaps he should stop delaying and figure it out quickly. Furin was moving back a little at that moment, and felt that he stopped because of the oldest forest, which was also walking with its back to him. Now that they met, the warrior noticed that his old friend was completely exhausted and was breathing very heavily. Then Udan admitted with regret that each of these warriors was a real monster, who were equal in strength to each other. He especially remembered the one who fought with him just a few minutes ago. This was a girl who was in no way inferior in power to Furin the Strong in her youth. The warrior simply could not believe his ears. But the elder of the forest seriously said that he was not saying that because she trampled him into the dirt. This reminded Furin of their past conversations, because once upon a time they fought back to back. Udan noticed that this was when Furin was still his old self. There was a short pause, after which the man said that he was far from the same, but his common sense was still with him. The elder liked this phrase, because he understood that perhaps this meant that his old friend would now help him. By that time, Orn was already tired of listening to all this, and he said that they would all like to sort this out as soon as possible, and therefore those of yours should stop chatting. Then the warrior turned to the Udan, and said that he now incredibly wants to hit him in the face. Another pause, after which the elder of the forest said that Furin the Strong had won, which means that he would give him the essence. He also said that now the warrior cannot be shy and hit him as hard as he wants. He was confident in his abilities and laughed, despite the fact that the enemy was already behind him, and seemed to be in full combat readiness. The enemy had enough reaction to block this blow with the help of his arm, which was wearing armor, but the warrior said in a quiet voice that it would not be possible to hold him, because if he continues to try to withstand his blow, then one day he will certainly break. Now the action was already unfolding in another place, and the captain of the First Order of Knighthood named Commando spoke to Orn. This dialogue had happened before, so he told his captain that he had received information from the farmer, who for some reason had a magic sword with him. They talked about an old man with unusually blonde hair who entered the Phantom King's lair and came out unharmed. Last time, before the Lost Citadels, they missed him, but then there was no doubt that he was heading towards the elven forest. The commando said that it was good that they finally managed to attack the warrior's target. But the farmer carrying a sword with him sounded a little strange to him. He replied that it was strange, but in fact that was the reason why the team called Orn for this. The team told his subordinate that the strong Furin would be on a completely different level than those the vice commander had to face before. Orn thanked him for these words, but he is sure that there is no need to worry, since he is sure that this is just a decrepit old man, who is intoxicated by the weakness of his past. Fearlessness was undoubtedly the vice commander's strength, but vanity poisoned him and prevented him from advancing further. The team looked at the commander and asked if he knew why he was called a warrior. Because the reason was not that he wielded a holy sword. Everything was much simpler. The strong Furin was called that way because he was so damn strong. And it was at that moment, when the Furin approached his opponent from behind, that Orn felt it. Moreover, it was very unpleasant for him that such a strong opponent treated him as if he were some kind of hooligan with a stick. It turned out that after such a strong blow, which Orn could barely withstand, the warrior still had the strength to deliver several more such blows. I had to get down on one knee and block all these blows, while simultaneously experiencing incredible pain in my joints. It was not clear where he had so much power in his empty hand, but what became obvious was that Orn had greatly underestimated his opponent. While he was thinking about this, Furin swung his fist again, preparing to turn the deputy commander's head into mush in just one blow. Then he said that he promised that he would hit only once, but that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. But the strong Furin dodged his counterattack and swung again, at the same time saying that somehow this would not have turned out noble. While the fist was flying towards his head, the warrior suddenly noticed that someone's blade was approaching his head at very high speed. He immediately moved his body to evade, and he did it quite well. It turned out that this was one of the assistants to the deputy commander of the First Knightly Order, who was now standing in the way of Orn. He drove him away and continued the attack, while the strong Furin shouted to his opponent that they should probably stick together. The warrior also added that he was not saying this because he was worried about himself, but advised this so that his opponents would have at least some chance. Orn, until this moment, he tried to get at least a drop of seriousness out of his opponent, but he just couldn't do it. Furin again focused his strength on his bare hands, and said that the painfully serious are very rarely loved. He tried to reach, but the enemy managed to evade quite quickly, and at the same time inflict several very serious wounds. In a moment, Furin remembered how painful it was to feel the pain after being stabbed, and therefore for some time he could not even move. Orn was ready to deliver one of the most important blows of his life, and at that moment he said that the strong Furin was simply a relic of the past. Now he found himself behind his opponent, and swung very hard in order to deliver a vertical blow. But when he did this, he noticed that in his hand there was now no sword, which was just supposed to turn one warrior into two. Furin stood unshakably, and it turned out that he blocked the attack with his sword, simply by grasping the sharpest blade with his bare hands. He turned his head and said that it was very rude to talk about a relic of the past, and added that Orn would have to start from scratch. Orn's face almost completely disappeared, since his attack had just been stopped with his bare hand. The man began to ignore his opponent, and said that although the sword itself was good, the same could not be said about its owner. Just looking at the amount of passive mana in the accelerated forging, one could admire and say that many swords of extremely high quality were put into the weapon. It seems that the human king is still fussing around trying to create a new holy sword. Orn tried to make another attack from the back, but this time the strong Furin, without looking, blocked this attack too with the help of his new sword. He slowly turned his head and looked at his opponent out of the corner of his eye. Now the sword was at the throat of the deputy commander of the First Knightly Order, who no longer knew what to do. Suddenly, at one moment, a sword also appeared near the neck of the strong Furin, and it was not clear where it came from. It turned out that right behind the warrior stood another henchman of the Knightly Order, who approached him unnoticed. The warrior turned his head towards the new enemy, notifying that he was now engaged in interrupting the men's duel. This phrase made Orn laugh, as he realized that he now realized who this warrior really was. It also became clear that when the strong Furin swung his sword, the energy from this spread to the wall, with the help of which the elves defended themselves from the outside world. The elder of the forest, who was fighting at that moment, asked the warrior what he was going to do with such a serious crack in the castle wall. After all, he initially wanted to just hit the enemy once, and not blow everything to hell. Then Furin could not stand it, and shouted that this wall was breaking from blows with bare hands, so let them better build a new one. Orn already thought that he absolutely completely and absolutely accurately understood the psychotype of his opponent, but now he could not explain why he was so calm. This irritated him very much, and he even lowered his sword, which the strong Furin could still calmly hold near the throat. He turned his head towards the mage of the Knightly Order whose name was Step, and ordered him to prepare a retreat. The man was upset that it looked like these two were going to leave with everyone else without even finishing. Orn laughed and said that after the captain, it was the first time in his life that he had encountered such a bar, and perhaps this level was even higher. Then the warrior said that it was a great honor, but this does not mean that Orn can just leave now, and now he needs to ask Furin about it. At that moment, a portal began to appear above the deputy commander's head, and he said that they had prepared a mass teleportation spell in advance. Also, he added that now something will fly in order to divert attention. Furin the Strong didn't understand what he was talking about, but it seems that the deputy commander was talking about one monstrous and powerful shot. The warrior thought that even if they stalled for time, he still would not release the hostages. Well, when this shell flew in his direction, he realized that it looked like he wouldn't get away with it just like that. The energy of this arrow was so great that the sword that he managed to capture somehow coped with the task of blocking. When the energy after the first arrow dissipated, several more small arrows appeared in the sky, which emitted a large amount of energy. At that moment, the bodies of all members of the Knightly Order had practically disappeared into thin air, and when the warrior shouted that he was talking about one shot, Orn replied that there was only one. It was somehow ignoble. The most terrible thing at this moment was that the bear was one step away from death, as one of the members of the Knightly Order swung an axe at him. But the bear was lucky, because at the very last moment his opponent simply disappeared, and thereby left Gom alive. The elf, who was also on the verge of death due to the large number of opponents, also could not believe that she was saved, but she adapted very quickly and said that it looked like they had won. The action moved to a small mountain that was located not far from the elven forest, and on which there was an archer of the Knightly Order. This archer said that this decision of the vice-captain was very unexpected, and added that he could not even think that there was a possibility of losing. He answered him that everything was as if another heaven had been discovered above the heavens, and in that battle he felt like a frog. Now the entire First Knightly Order realized how strong their opponent was, and realized how much effort they needed to put in to defeat him. Orn had used all his trump cards. He still would not have been able to win, even if each member of the group did this. In any case, everyone understood that this was a complete defeat. The mission of the First Knightly Order to accompany the warrior could be declared a failure. The place where such a powerful battle took place looked like a scorched desert. The warrior looked up for a few more seconds to make sure that no more arrows were flying from the sky. The elder of the forest approached him and asked if his friend was okay. Then the warrior replied that everything was fine with him, and since we didn't quite figure it out, now it was time to talk about that thing. Udan said that he should not worry, since he keeps his word. However, the warrior will have to answer one question. Namely, he was wondering why Furin the Strong still needed the essence of the forest. A long time ago, the action took place in the basement, a place that few people knew about. At this place, the strong Furin spoke with some person about how this stranger wanted to know more about the lich. He told me that he was going to do this. Rather, he was simply interested in the study of this process itself. Furin noticed that for him this is the same thing, since he is very curious, and until he personally reaches the end, he never finishes. It was for this reason that one day he created the holy sword, which Furin then possessed. Although no matter how they call it a saint, in essence it is a real magical sword. And such a magical sword eats away the body and spirit of its owner. The warrior said that for this reason he only uses it when absolutely necessary, and usually carries it in a magic bag on his belt. Bendal said that he would constantly exert influence, and in the end this sword would take possession of the owner, and this would lead to dire consequences. The warrior asked him not to worry, since he is Furin the Strong, and no sword will be able to take possession of his body and spirit due to the oversaturation of mana. But Bendal told him that because of this oversaturation, his body could not stand it and simply explode at one moment. Or the warrior will simply go crazy and begin to behave as if captive by a Dark Lord. But if you apply the essence of the lich, then physical deficiencies can be overcome. Blood, nerves, everything is controlled by liches by magic. It is for this reason that no wounds are fatal to them. Furin strongly admitted that this information was truly amazing, and asked Bendal how he knew this. He answered him that once he conducted some experiments with the Ghost King, and that was almost the only time the Phantom King wanted to die. The warrior noticed that it seems that now he knows why he once ordered him to bring him alive. There was a short pause, after which Furin asked Bendal how long he was going to be in this unusual guise. Bendal said that he only now remembered this, and added that he was used to hiding his identity in front of other people. He looked much younger and more attractive, and he was much more comfortable in this guise. The action moved to the present day, and specifically to the Tree of Madness, where repair work was now taking place, and where everyone was now working. You could also hear the Elder of the Forest laughing very loudly in his office. Furin the Strong's slightly less loud laugh could be heard. When they both calmed down, Udan said that he could not believe that the warrior was going to resurrect Bendal. But the most interesting thing was that after this happens, the warrior is going to turn him into a lich. The two of them laughed again, despite the fact that everyone else at the table didn't find it particularly funny. Then the daughter of the Elder of the Forest, who was that same elf, asked her father why he was listening to all this nonsense. She didn't like that Furin didn't talk about the destruction of liches, but about their creation. And as a sacrifice he asked to bring the essence of the forest. Then her father answered her that an agreement is an agreement, and they, like the ancient people of elves, must keep their word. The only thing he still wanted to know was the reason why the warrior now wants to resurrect Bendal after 30 years. Bendal died during the fight with the Demon King, and now rested in peace in the Black Earth. Therefore, it was necessary to find out why Furin wanted to bother him. He replied that there was no need to interfere in their personal relationships, and they'd better make sure that each side gives what it has to give, and takes what it has to take. But the Elder of the Forest did not agree with this, and in his opinion he should know what the warrior was really up to. He made the assumption that this was all planned solely for the sake of the Holy Sword. Then several elves who were sitting at the table also said that they heard that the Holy Sword was lost. Udan said that he had hoped that this was not actually true, but now looking at the driver's reaction, it became obvious to him that he had indeed lost his Holy Sword. He was sad to hear that during all this time the warrior had not been able to get rid of his obsession. There was a slight pause, which was destroyed by Furin, who said that the Elder of the Forest was right, that he was really looking for the Holy Sword. He was in various places: in the Grey Mountain Dragon's Nest, in the garden of the Elf King Anagriga, in the underground coffin of the first man on earth, and nowhere was the Holy Sword. When all these memories surfaced in his head, he hit the table with all his fist. And after that, he said that he could not find the slightest clue anywhere, and at one time he even considered this task impossible. At that second, the Elder of the Forest was only thinking that the table that shattered into small pieces after the warrior's blow was worth a lot of money. Furin the Strong said that all he wants is to find the Holy Sword, and added that for this he is ready to do anything. Then Udan told him that he was out of his mind, and it seemed that he was really obsessed with his sword. Furin answered him that he was still sane, and therefore advised the elder to keep his word. Udan realized that now there was no point in deviating from the task at hand, and he told the warrior that he could follow him. They began to walk along the dark corridors of one of the great trees, and the warrior had very little memory of this entire road. It was very similar, and it was difficult to understand which turn was made. Meanwhile, the action moved to the dungeon, in which the shackles had just been removed from the hands of the Lord of the Dead. He was very happy and said that he was glad that everything happened just according to plan. After he said this, the elf again approached one of the cages and looked at the one who was on the other side of the bars. Then he said that the ruler of the dead was released as a result of an agreement with a warrior, but this agreement did not apply to this prisoner. The bishop said that he didn't have to let him go, but this is not worth doing for the reason that he himself will be able to get out without any special obstacles. Then the mercenary left the cage, and one of the guards began to scream, because he did not understand where his handcuffs were. When a short amount of time had passed, and they were about to leave, the guard shouted to the Lord of the Dead that he could not do this, since he was their prisoner. Then purple energy began to circulate around the Lord, and he said that in his opinion, he could do this. The elf realized that it would be a mistake to endure this, and therefore he also began to release the energy of his body. The Lord of the Dead suddenly relaxed and asked the guard not to get excited. But then, he suddenly knelt down and directed his energy through his fingers directly onto the floor of the dungeon. Everything around began to glow with a bright purple light, and then the Lord said that he would leave a small, very nice gift for the guard. The guard began to scream, because he did not understand what was about to happen and what the Lord was going to do. The mercenary who was standing nearby seemed to very quickly understand what was about to happen, and for this reason did not stop the first of the 4 commanders of the Dark Lord. He didn't want to miss a second, since I get to see magic of such a high level every day. The warrior and his old friend walked along the corridor, and Furin said that he did not know that such a space could be hidden inside a tree. His comrade replied that this was all in order to protect the essence of the forest from such prying eyes as the warrior himself. They walked a few more turns, and then the elder of the forest said that they were there. Furin the Strong for the first time saw the corpse of the first man on this earth, who was also called the Wooden Giant. He concluded that it seems that the core he is looking for is inside him. In an uncertain voice, the elder of the forest replied that probably the essence of the forest was there. Furin the Strong turned his head towards his friend in order to see an emotion on his face that would mean that he was joking. But she wasn't there. Events again moved to another place, and now the troops who dug a deep hole threw their brothers into it. A priest also came here. I read a prayer before they departed, and asked God to save the souls of these creatures. The soldiers who had to carry the corpses of their friends did not like the fact that the priest simply read prayers, and they had to do all the dirty work. One of them said that the priests make no sense in this, since no one will come to life from his prayer, since they are all dead forever. But everyone was very surprised when the corpses began to move one by one, and their movements were even more like the conscious movements of a drunkard. The priest extended his hand to one of them and asked him how he was feeling, and at the same time asked him to take his hand. But as soon as the dead man got close enough to him, he immediately bit him, after which he stood up to deliver additional blows of a tearing nature to his body. There were more and more of them, and it was becoming more and more difficult for the soldiers to hold the revenants. Meanwhile, the general calmly tried to fall asleep in his camp, but it was difficult for him to do this due to the constant noise. He only needed 5 minutes of silence in order to fall asleep, but it seems that no one was going to give him such a luxury. When he opened his eyes, he saw a soldier in front of him who had already tried to bite off a piece of his face. Meanwhile, the soldiers who were in the camp also began to scream and at the same time run away from the camp, since there were most of the dead there. The general managed to deal with this dead man, and after that he left his tent in order to find the commander. Well, when he looked around, he didn't find a guard or even one member of his army. All he saw around him was a very large fire, and several corpses lying on the ground. The most interesting thing was where the special squad is located, which should only be engaged in protecting the general. Suddenly, an image of death with a scythe appeared right in front of the general. The man didn't even know what to say to this, so this phantom said that everything that happens here happens at the will of the Phantom King. When the general heard this, he then removed the protection for his eye, and added that he would have to decide everything himself, since he seemed to have been underestimated. His look became more confident, and he added that the post of commander of the Western Front is not given to everyone. His eye began to glow very brightly, and release a large amount of energy, thereby helping him become stronger instantly. The Lord of the Dead, who was watching all this, laughed out loud at me, because he realized that a very interesting object had begun to emerge from under his magical trap. After a few seconds, it became clear that this was someone's head, which had almost completely crawled out from under the earth. The elf and the mercenary clapped their hands, as it was as disgusting as it was magical. Then the Lord of the Dead answered them that the head did not appear here, but moved, because the head of the enemy army commander had just been cut off and moved to this basement. They were silent for a few seconds, looking at how surprised the elf's face was. And then the Lord asked him if he recognized this face. The elf, without thinking twice, said that this was the head of the commander of the enemy army, since his right eye had magic, and therefore he wore a prosthesis. The elf held in his hands the head that had been cut off not long ago, and realized that this bald man with prosthetic eyes was definitely him. It was not clear how this was even possible, but the Lord of the Dead explained that thanks to a combination of 3 spells of the highest category, and 1 black magic spell. Also, he turned his head towards the elf and said that where there is a corpse, there will always be the control of the Lord of the Dead. This guard came to the realization that this wizard was indeed a very terrible creature. Their supreme elder had not been able to end this war for the 3rd year, but now it happened in an instant. Meanwhile, the Lord of the Dead and the mercenary began to leave, and one of them said that it seemed like this was a sufficient price for freedom. But the couple was never able to go far, since it was the meeting that Furin came out strong. He had not seen the Lord of the Dead for a very long time, and this time he called him a non-ghost king, and a ghost lord. The Phantom King said that his name was not that, but the warrior told him that he was caught by such weak creatures, and therefore now he was demoted to lord. There was no point in arguing further, so the lord decided to ask whether the agreement had been fulfilled, and whether it was possible to obtain the essence of the forest. He replied that she was with him, and Vladika was very surprised when he heard this, so he asked him to show her. At this time, behind the back of the strong Furin, a thug of incredible size appeared, who could not even fit into this basement at full height. This giant was so big that it cast a shadow on all 3 of them at once. Without thinking twice, the Lord decided to ask the warrior who this big carcass was. The warrior answered him that in front of them was none other than the essence of the forest. Some time ago, a strong Furin looked at the elder of the forest with crazy eyes in order to find out what he meant when he said the phrase maybe. He asked him to calm down and listen to what he had to say next. He said that the essence of the forest was created from the dead wood giant Udan. In the past, when he died, his body was divided into many parts and scattered all over the world. From his body the essence of the forest was created. The warrior said that he did not ask for a lecture on history, and he simply needed the essence of the forest here and now. Then the elf said that you need to know about this, and asked the strong Furin to come closer to him. The 2 of them moved to the altar, and the elder of the forest said that they are only guardians, and they do not know what the essence of the forest is, and what it looks like. In the past, many tried to acquire the essence, and use it for their own selfish purposes. But in the end, no one was able to do this. Then the elder of the forest that he had already told the warrior before that he could not give him this item. It turns out that he could not do this because he did not know how. Now the backstory could be completed, and the elder of the forest ordered the strong Furin to bring his head closer to the water source. When the warrior did this, he told the elf that if he now tells him that in fact the essence of the forest is in his heart, he will crack it several times. But the elder of the forest did not even intend to do this, as he swung his leg strongly and hit the warrior right on the ass. From this, Furin the Strong did a somersault and instantly fell straight into the altar, under the words of the elf that water knows the answers to everything. From that moment on, everything depended only on how the warrior behaved in new circumstances. Furin the Strong was very angry when he raised his head from the altar and shouted that he was an idiot, a real bastard. But when he fully raised his head and looked around, he realized that now he was in a completely different place. It seemed that he was now in another dimension, and everything here was nothing like in the previous world. Actually, everything here looked pretty good, except for the obvious. Although the warrior liked everything here, he even relaxed a little when he saw the beautiful white tree in front of him. But very soon this tree disappeared due to the fact that it seemed that this tree was only a reflection of something to the eye. The tree reappeared before the powerful when that eye opened again. It turned out that in front of him there was a giant, who was as tall as several hundred warriors. Now the realization came to Furin's head that in front of him was the same wooden giant Udan, and this was the world that he created in another dimension. But the giant didn't even hear what this man was saying, but simply looked at this insect for a few seconds. Then he waved his palm and said that because of the rotten food, mosquitoes had already begun to appear. He dealt a rather sharp but not particularly strong blow to the place where the strong Furin stood, and pieces of earth were scattered in all directions. But it wasn't particularly clear why the giant couldn't touch the ground harder, as if something was stopping him. Right under his palm at that moment the warrior was trying with all his might to fight the giant's hand. Then the giant thought a little and realized that it looked like it was not a mosquito, but some kind of stag. Furin, who was strong, and while holding this palm, blood began to flow from his nose due to excess pressure. A few seconds later the palm disappeared, and now the warrior simply stood in the same position on earth. Then he heard someone's voice to the side, which, without any accent, said that the person had never been here before. A giant came to meet him, and said that it was just a small misunderstanding. This giant took on the appearance of an ordinary person in size, and landed closer to the warrior. When he said that it was just a misunderstanding, the strong Furin answered him that because of this misunderstanding he had just almost died. Then the giant answered him that in this world, no one dares to die without his permission. When the warrior began to look at his hands, the giant told him that his body would fully recover in less than a few seconds. But then he turned his head towards the giant, and said that he would not have to do this, since if someone else had been in his place, he would have turned into a chop. The giant moved to the side and said that this stranger was right, and a simple person could not resist his strength. Then he wondered who it was, and Furin wanted to tell him that his name was Warrior, but then he corrected it to an elderly man passing by. At the same time, calling two small thrones from under the earth, the giant said that this was the first time he had heard such a strange name. A warrior, that is, no, an elderly man passing by. When these two thrones were already taken out of the ground, the giant said that he was glad to meet you, and also added that he was a little late with greetings. The warrior said that this was not his name, but he realized that he didn't really want to correct it either. At the same time, sitting on the throne, Furin said that he already understood who this giant is. This is one of the first people on this earth, the man whom the Creator created, the one that people call a divine being. Wooden giant Udan. He also added that if he had known that he would appear before a divine being, he would have changed his clothes in advance. Udan answered him that although mortals call him a divine being, this creature died a long time ago, and he is just a creature that was created with the help of memories. This means that he is not, in fact, a divine being, and a warrior should not honor him. Furin said that this is good, and then he will speak to him on a first-name basis. After a second, he ordered him to give up the essence of the forest. After thinking for a long time, Udan told me that he couldn't do this, and the warrior asked why. The giant needed a little time to think, and he said that this was all for the reason that he himself did not know what the essence of the forest was. The warrior jumped from his throne and began to shout, asking if he really did not know what the essence of the forest was. He quickly realized that he himself did not know what it was. Life energy, or something similar, or perhaps just enormous strength like a giant. Udan said that if the essence of the forest is a huge force, then it makes some sense. But even if this is so, he still cannot give her to a man by name. Warrior, that is, no, an elderly man passing by. When the giant said that he could not do this because he did not have the strength, the warrior struck the ground with his hand, as the giant himself had done. Then he said that this was nonsense, since the Udan hit the Furin a few minutes ago, and almost crushed him in one movement. The giant thought about it, and said that he was a creature that had no strength, and at the same time, had endless strength. In a second he became incredibly large and said that he could turn into anyone and anything. It can now destroy everything and at the same time create anything. But since he is just an appearance, this incredible power is not his, and he can only use it here. And what is most interesting for a warrior is that it is simply impossible to transfer this power to someone. Furin thought a little and said that in fairy tales, everything is usually given away in such places, and therefore the giant must also give him something. Udan called the animal and said that he could give him an incredible gift in the form of this wild and wonderful deer. He told him that he could pick him up right now, but the deer immediately got scared and began to run away to the side. The giant turned back into his larger version and asked the man if he had anything else to say. The warrior needed to think a little, as he was very upset that he was unable to obtain the essence of the forest. It was not at all what he had imagined, and moreover, he did not know what he wanted to get looked like. Meanwhile, Udan took the firkin in his hand and said that if he has nothing to say, then he will send him into the world. The world of a warrior, that is, no, an elderly man passing by. But at the very last moment the warrior shouted that he still had to give him the deer. The deer appeared right before the eyes of the firkin, and Udan said that he could not give him incredible strength, but the warrior burned the deer could not take it for himself. Of course, this is not the incredible power and capabilities that he wanted to receive, but just the appearance of an ordinary deer. Then the warrior told the giant that from that moment he understood everything, and now the Udan must understand everything, namely, that from this moment on, he is the essence of the forest. But the giant replied that he was none other than the appearance of an Udan. To which the warrior said that in his opinion, Udan is precisely the essence of the forest. If we consider that he recently said that the appearance can come out of here, then the appearance of the divine creature must go after the warrior. The giant thought about it, and said that this man is a very funny mortal, since many people have been here, but he is the first who wanted to take him. Udan did not have to be persuaded, and he said that since the warrior, that is, no, the elderly man passing by wanted it that way, he would follow him. The action shifted, and now the Lord of the Dead said that, as he expected, the essence of the forest is not a banal force. He examined the giant from all sides. He had not seen the soul of God for a long time, the appearance of the soul of divine consciousness. The giant, in turn, saw in front of him a creature that broke the curse and became immortal, which was also quite interesting. These conversations between two incredibly strong characters a little tired the mercenary, who could only remain silent. It was also quite interesting for the forest elder to watch all this, but he was also interested in how long they would stand there. Gam, who approached him, noticed that the warrior was not even visible here, and then the elder of the forest turned his head towards him. He informed him that he was preparing to leave, since his slovenly appearance aroused his sympathy, and he ordered him to be shaved and changed. Udan was constantly tormented by the thought that they had been trying for so many years to win this war, but it ended so easily in one day. The warrior who destroyed their fortress, and the black mage, whom they hated, eventually saved them, but the war was not over yet. It was rather a respite, and if they gather an army again and attack, they will no longer be able to defend themselves. The bear said that they would not sit idly by and would gather an army, but the elder of the forest interrupted him, and said that it was all in vain. He looked again at his possessions, and after a few seconds of pause he told Gom that they were leaving this forest. This caused the bear to be very surprised, but Elder Udan said that they protected this forest in order to protect the essence of the forest, and at the same time, their goal is to protect all guardians of the forest. During the 3 years of war, they lost an untold number of relatives, friends and soldiers. And now the elder of the forest cannot allow this to happen again. Moreover, when the day has come when the essence of the forest just walks around without permission, without giving them another choice. The bear thought for a while, and then said that since the supreme elder decided so, he would follow him. Then the Udan ordered him to gather all the elders, since the hour had come to determine their future. Now the actions have moved a little, and now everything was happening in the place where all the comrades of the Firkin of the Strong were located. He walked and touched his new beard with his hand, which was oddly short compared to what it was before. Moreover, he now had new clothes, and also new shoes. Seeing 3 comrades, he said that their team included 1 entity, 1 corpse, and 1 stranger. In general, everything is assembled. He notified everyone to start moving and move on to their next destination. Suddenly, they were stopped by an elf who appeared from nowhere. The girl said that the Supreme Elder ordered to give him the clothes of his colleagues, and also say the following, namely, that their people are eternally grateful. One way or another, thanks to them, they will be able to safely leave this place. When the warrior said that this was hardly possible, the elf replied that she would become stronger so as not to turn to him for help in the future, and the day will come when she will definitely pay him this debt. Firkin, the strong one, began to leave and said that he did not like tenderness. The elf, in turn, did not understand this gesture. He raised his voice a little and said that he does not refuse, and if the elf wants to pay him for the debt then let him try. All the clothes were transferred to the essence of the forest, and the 4 of them began to move forward towards further adventure. Do not forget that the war was in full swing, and a huge army of people stood before their enemy. This enemy was the orcs, who were known for the fact that, despite their low intelligence, they were very good at fighting head-on attacks. They all screamed very loudly, and they did not have the same formation as people, but they still inspired terror. One of the orcs who stood closest to the commander said that he needed to attack and kill all the people. Well, then the orc commander said that the angry Gog should calm down and wait a little. They all gathered today for the sake of war with people, and in order to destroy them all. He raised his sword and told his army that this is a war between the main ones, and today new blood will be shed. The orc commander still didn't know who his opponent was, so he shouted that he was the leader of the Shieldstone tribe, Fearless Grog. He wanted to know what kind of person his opponent was. Then one of the soldiers blew into a special wind instrument, which immediately made a loud sound. When this happened, several soldiers who were in the front row got down on one knee. The emperor himself passed by them, and he unwaveringly looked forward and also moved unwaveringly. He said very loudly that he was the one with whom the orcs would fight today. The fearless Grog began to scream even louder, and said that he needed to fight right now and shed human blood. Warrior James, who stood right next to the emperor, handed him a spear while everyone listened to the squeals and screams of the orcs. Then the emperor swung his spear and said that perhaps he would not refuse such an interesting fight. The orc screamed and just watched as the spear flew towards him at high speed, but due to the fact that it was incredibly difficult to estimate the flight speed of this object, the spear passed him in less than an instant. The energy it emitted during flight was enough to pierce the bodies of several orcs at once right behind the commander's back. Then the commander said that the man was very strong, and for this he would pay with his life. But by that time, the emperor had already come very close to him, and even the leader of the Stone and Shield tribe was a little scared, especially when he realized that the emperor was much taller than him, and said that now it was the fearless Grog's turn to die. Then he turned his head and asked the angry Gog for help, since he was just ready for battle more than anyone else. But when he looked here, he noticed that the angry one had disappeared somewhere, and now he was not even visible. The emperor said that now it was his turn to attack, and with one movement of his sword he cut off the head of the fearless Grog. Now the head of the enemy army was defeated, and he took out a small cloth to wipe the blood from his sword. His henchmen came to him, and he ordered everyone to be killed in the name of his imperial greatness. The soldiers rushed towards their enemies amid cries that they needed to kill absolutely everyone and leave no one alive. Just a few minutes passed, and the subordinate who stood closer to the emperor congratulated him on his victory. But also, at the same time, news came that the commander of the Western Front had died. In addition, an army with 5,000 soldiers was destroyed due to the sudden attack of the dead. The emperor asked his subordinate to transfer Exit to command raise 10,000 soldiers and destroy this forest. But the emperor was most surprised when he read the name of his old acquaintance in the report. Then the subordinate said that Sir Zarganorn, who was pursuing the Furkan war, sent word that he finally met him in the forest to the elf, but failed in battle. The emperor said that it was interesting that the order failed. It is obvious that Furkan did not spend 30 years just like that. He ordered his subordinate to report to Dukhan Farwan and await further instructions. Then, he took another spear as he saw danger approaching ahead. It was an orc who was flying on a dragon and shouting something about revenge for the fearless Grog. All the emperor did was swing his spear and simply look at the approaching target. He then said that he hoped that the bag was still with the warrior. He placed his foot on the head of the dragon, who had just lost his life because he followed the order of an orc. The enemy was defeated, and the emperor was among the victors since he killed 2 of the strongest opponents with just 2 movements. Meanwhile, a small group walked through the forest, and the warrior answered the question, saying that he gave his bag to one friend. The Ghost King couldn't believe it, since such an expensive bag of secret space was given away just like that. Kirkin said that he did this so that he would keep it. The mercenary, who also walked along with the whole group, asked what was in this bag and why the emperor was looking for it. The hero replied that usually the King of Devils was in this bag, and a few other little things. Everyone was very surprised when they heard this, but the warrior did not react at all and added that Arel was also there. The mercenary asked the warrior if he really wanted to say that he had imprisoned the Devil King, who had long been considered dead, in a sack. Then the warrior turned his head and congratulated everyone present on the fact that they were in a limited club of those who know the truth. He also pointed his finger at the mercenary, and said that he already knew too much, and in general the Furkin did not think about taking his group. The mercenary said that his name is the magician Adal, and he travels the world to find his teacher, and he thinks that with this group he can find at least a clue. Then Furkin said that he did not have time to look for his teacher, so it was better to return home right now. But the warrior thought deeply when he heard that his teacher's name was Kolbar Braid. This was a magician whom everyone called a great sage. And it seems that the strong Furkin also knew him well, since he was also his teacher, and taught the young warrior for a long time. The warrior changed his mood a little, and in general his voice became more categorical when he said that this old man had died a long time ago. The mercenary replied that he did not die, but put him as the 13th lich. Lich, former great sage. The Phantom King added that perhaps this person would help them find the holy sword and resurrect his friend. Then the warrior thought a little, and told the mercenary that this old man is a real liar, and everyone thought that it seems that Furkin is the only one who calls the sage a liar. The hero added that they would proceed according to plan, focusing on the resurrection of Bendel, and completing secondary tasks along the way, because who knows, maybe they will be able to meet this old man Halbar. The warrior also advised the mercenary not to interfere with them. It was necessary to emphasize what they had already achieved. Therefore, the warrior said that they managed to get the essence of the forest, and asked his assistant what was left for them. He said that the essence of the forest is this sacrifice that they must make to the dead soul. This means that now they need nothing more than a heart that will restore the body of a dead man. This heart was possessed by the one the group was talking about not so long ago. This essence held a very precious crystal, and said that the heart of the earth has inexhaustible magical power. The creature felt incredible power, which meant that it could now do anything with this power. For example, make your dream come true and resurrect the king of devils. Even though the Phantom King said that there were cases when they wanted to resurrect the Devil King, the warrior still believed that this was impossible. Further actions moved to the village, which was located near one of the nearby mountains. The most important building and establishment of this village was a tavern, where guests stayed from time to time. Suddenly, right in the middle of the night, someone came here who was wearing a hood. The men who were drinking at that time immediately drew attention to the one about whom they still knew nothing. The hooded stranger immediately approached the bar and approached the bartender to order something from him. All he needed was a glass of the strongest drink they had. Then the tavern owner said that the strongest they have is strawberry milk. It turns out that this was an unusual person, since from his fangs one could tell that these were clearly non-human teeth. The stranger began to drink strawberry milk, until two men approached him, who behaved quite nicely, and who asked what fate brought him here. They also said that they are not scary at all, and the stranger may not even be afraid. When there was no answer, one of the men suggested that he was deaf, but the second said that they could speak with the help of gestures. For some reason, the stranger said that these cockroaches interfered with his momentary rest, and for this he would be punished. A moment later, the stranger stabbed one of the men with her bare hand straight through the heart. Then the second man who was standing nearby was very frightened, and because of this he could not even move. His shock was so strong that he could not even utter any other word other than what came out. It turned out that this stranger was a vampire who had put on a hood and generally inconspicuous clothing. A few tens of minutes later, the entire settlement was on fire, due to the fact that the vampires began to have fun. They destroyed all opponents on their way, and the streets of the village were littered with corpses. It turns out that there were quite a few vampires here, but some of them immediately flew away. The vampire who was in the tavern appreciated the taste of strawberry milk, but also noticed that now it would not be possible to drink it here. Ire approached him and greeted his brother. He told him that now the mission here is over, and they will take some cockroaches into the lair to feed on their bodies. Suddenly, right in the middle of the dialogue, they heard someone scream, and this undoubtedly caught their attention. It looks like this person tried to fight back, and then they decided that it looked like Zab Mob. He got overexcited because he couldn't deal with the person quickly. But things were much worse for them, since this man managed to grab the vampire by the neck quite successfully. An instant, and this vampire's neck was broken with just one movement, and the crunch of his cartilage could be heard tens of meters away. The vampires couldn't believe what had just happened, and like the man in the tavern, they couldn't even move. Then the unfamiliar man said that he told this vampire to stand still, and he began to run somewhere. There was a short pause, after which the warrior ordered the remaining vampires to run away from here as quickly as possible before he took out a fly swatter. The vampires came to their senses and became incredibly angry, because they could not understand how an ordinary person had just killed a vampire. One of them instantly made a dash to attack and drink all his blood right now, but he stopped at the very last second, as the essence of the forest appeared behind the strong Furin. The vampire was immobilized due to shock, and did not even understand how a mercenary appeared from the side and swung his stick at him. The blow, and the vampire is already unconscious on the floor, and the remaining vampire utters only one word. The last vampire was incredibly angry when he saw this, and immediately brought his wings into a fighting position. Pushing away with all his might, he shouted that he wouldn't just leave it like that, and would tell their master everything. Furin the Strong didn't think for very long, since he already had a pre-prepared plan. He simply pointed his finger at the vampire to quickly fly away, and then he gave an order to the essence of the forest, saying that this was a bad bird. The brute immediately fired something at the target. The warrior began to look around in order to understand what the thug actually threw at the target, if there were no objects nearby. Meanwhile, the vampire was flying away, and hearing a characteristic whistle behind him, he decided to turn around in order to see what was there. He was met by a mercenary who was flying at him at supersonic speed and had already swung his stick. The collision took place at a fairly high altitude, and the warrior wondered how the mercenary was even going to land. The essence of the forest began to run forward in order to catch what he threw at the vampire. Meanwhile, the warrior decided to ask the Lord for what purpose the vampires were destroying everything here. He told him that vampires often do this when hiding among people. But they almost never travel in packs. They unite forces only in cases when they want to take revenge on the hunters. The essence of the forest, meanwhile, ran up to the place where the mercenary would fall, and caught his improvised ball. The Lord, meanwhile, continued and said that they also do this when the vampire lord called them all to war. The warrior began to help the affected residents, and asked the Lord if the Lord of Vampires was his friend. He replied that they were in different subordination, so they rarely saw each other. This meant that the vampire lord had gathered them all, but no one understood why. The man, whose wife Furin saved while he was talking with the Lord of the Dead, thanked him and said that he saved her life. The warrior said that you shouldn't be very grateful, but it's better to just answer a few questions. But the man could not listen to these questions when he saw a descendant of the magic clan in front of him. But the warrior corrected him and said that this was not a descendant of a magic clan, but a god. The man screamed very loudly, because he could not believe that in front of him was a real magical god. The warrior hit him once, not too hard, with his hand since he didn't like this wording, and then he repeated it again and said that he just wants to find out what happened here, and will release the man as soon as he tells everything. The stranger started over and said that he was a simple farmer, and therefore did not know anything in particular. The only thing he knew about was that vampires first appeared a month ago in the village of Two Harps behind the mountain. They conquered the holy place in a matter of minutes, and then began to destroy the villages around and take people and dwarves captive. It was as if they all settled in this mountain, because they expanded the front only near this mountain. They also stayed in this fortress for a long time, so it is believed that they planned something very grandiose. The warrior told the Lord that he was very well informed about the news of the world. But the Ghost King was more interested in why a talented man was a farmer. Furin the Strong was just heading to the lava anvil, since the last location of the heart of the earth was there. It seems that the vampires have also come for him, and taking this artifact will not be so easy. Despite the fact that the Phantom King tried to dissuade them from this idea, the warrior ordered everyone to continue moving because they should not give their hearts to some vampires. The vampire who came to the Lord received a glass thrown right into his face. All because the Lord was not happy that his soldiers were killed by some ordinary person. The vampire who came with the news asked his master for forgiveness, and said that the scouts reported that they saw it with their own eyes. The Lord was wondering what kind of person dared to kill his soldiers, since from now on this mission turned out to be impossible. Whatever happened there, the Lord believed that they could not leave it unpunished. Decisions had to be made, and the master chose him. The most categorical of all. He turned his head and said Mogalis Durant that his time had finally come. It turns out that people were now working very backbreaking labor in the laurel anvil. There was a very pungent smell of sweat, and an even stronger smell of blood. The dwarves were chained to special shackles that prevented them from leaving, and they constantly hit the red stone with pickaxes. They got tired very quickly, and when one of them threw away the pick and said that he couldn't do it anymore, his friend informed him that he couldn't stop. Suddenly the vampire grabbed him by the hair from behind and held him there for some time. After this, the vampire asked him who allowed him to rest, and ordered him to immediately begin work again. But the dwarf who was standing to his left suddenly shouted to the vampire, ordering him to stop this right now. The dwarves united and shouted that they could not do this anymore, and if their death was inevitable, then they would at least kill one mosquito before that. Someone came to this noise and stood in front of the vampire, who was already preparing for a fight with the dwarves. It turns out that it was Vladriel, the Magister and Lord of the Vampires. The dwarves began to reconsider among themselves, as they realized that they would definitely not be able to defeat the King of Mosquitoes now. The vampire reported to his master that these shorties were claiming labor rights and demanding rest. Then the overlord said that even the Demon King was acting under labor law, and said that they should be given rest immediately. At this very moment, a sphere appeared in his hand on the table, which was completely made of blood. This sphere was saturated with blood from the bodies of the dwarves who stood closest to the ruler. It was incredibly difficult for them to speak, but after a few seconds they died due to the fact that they had lost all the blood from their bodies. The dwarves who remained alive could not believe their eyes, as they looked at the corpses of their comrades, who had already turned grey. Then Vladril bit into a sphere of dwarven blood and said that if the others also wanted a vacation, he would quickly organize it for them. Everyone began to disperse to the sides, and talk about the fact that it looks like they will have to start working again. One of the vampires grabbed the dwarf who had fallen due to becoming exhausted and asked what to do with him. It quickly became apparent that this worker was poisoned by magical energy, and despite the immunity to magical energy that the short ones have, even he is not able to mine such strong magical stones. The vampire prepared to bite this worker, as he realized that he would still die from poisoning after some time. But at that very second a stone flew into his face and knocked out several of his teeth. The Lord looked at his subordinate, who even lost consciousness for a few seconds from the flying stone. It turned out that this stone was thrown by one of the dwarves, who said that she could cure this worker right now. She immediately came closer to the wounded man, despite the fact that the Lord said that it was unlikely that she had finished everything that he ordered her to do in the workshop. Approaching the dwarf, she gave him a special elixir to drink, and said that she had come here for the missing magic stones. The Lord thought for a while, after which he pulled a fountain of blood from the victim and said that the girl should be in the workshop. The girl couldn't believe what she was seeing now with her own eyes, and for some time she couldn't even say anything. But in reality, it was an optical illusion, and the vampire lord only drew a small amount of blood from himself. He began to walk away and said that this time he would ignore this violation, but he also wanted to warn that the only way to save all dwarves is not compassion, but the rapid completion of the creation of the heart of the earth. For this reason, he advised the girl to hurry up, since his patience was running out. The girl stood up, since proper help had been given to the victim, and in a low voice called the Lord of the Vampires a brute. One of the vampires, meanwhile, flew onto a tower, which was located not far from the nearest mountains. It was the overlord, and he asked the sentry where the group had gathered and where it was now. He answered him that 2 days ago they began to cross the mountain, and now they should cross it. This was good news, since Vladriel realized that soon they would meet with his subordinate, and then they would find out everything. They will find out what will happen if you touch one of the vampires and harm them. Duran, meanwhile, stood right next to the exit from the mountain, and waited for the moment when the group came out. He said that they should have appeared by now, but it was not clear why they were still not there after all this time. Suddenly, at that very moment, a rock collapse occurred right in the mountains, followed by an incredible explosion. It was just someone hitting a pile of stones very hard with their fist, which was inside the mountain. Of course, this man turned out to be a warrior, who, after making a hole in the hole with his bare hands, shouted to the group that he had found the way. The Phantom King came closer to him and said that the road is not created by destroying walls, but Firkin did not even listen to these words. Suddenly, a dwarf ran out of the cave, who seemed very happy that he was now free. Firkin the Strong said that it seems that this dwarf is not happy, but rather, on the contrary, is in fear. The mercenary, meanwhile, came closer and closer to the group, and said that she was upset that one had to be released, since he wanted to catch everyone, and for this reason the warrior asked why he was so serious. He answered him that if he misses it, he will not rise in experience. Despite the fact that the ghostly king did not like this idea, the warrior said that everyone should sleep to the fullest, and he is glad that this dwarf lived and runs towards life. But at some point in his run, someone threw a spear at his body, and he instantly died right there. Then Firkin the Strong told the mercenary that the most important thing is not work, but luck. Without luck, work is useless. In front of the group stood the troops who mounted combat boars that were dressed in armor. Riding these boars were dwarves, who were also all wearing very high-quality armor. The warrior told his group that it seemed they had come correctly, and added that he did not think that they would be greeted so solemnly. It seems that these dwarves had a commander who pulled his spear from the dwarf's body and pointed it at the strangers and ordered them to introduce themselves, since at that time it was not yet clear whether these strangers were their enemies, or rather allies. Also, some of them suggested that the three of them were wandering robbers, judging by their appearance. When the mercenary said that they were all wizards, the dwarf shouted that they were dirty black magicians. Moreover, they were most frightened when they saw the monster in front of them, which was Udan. The commander immediately gave the order to all his subordinates to attack the targets and kill them. The warrior's face became more frantic, and he shouted that physical violence is not the only way to solve the situation, but it is the fastest. One of the dwarves stood up to the others and said that he simply couldn't believe his eyes, namely, that he really finally met a strong Firkin. The warrior also recognized his old friend, and began to approach him in a friendly manner. They shook hands, and Firkin said that he didn't seem to have changed a bit, although he might have gotten a little smaller. He replied that if Firkin said it like that again, he would kill him with an axe. The warrior said that with his height, at most it would hit him on the knee. Mogalis Duran silently watched everything that was happening, and at that moment he already had a fairly clear plan of action. A friend who had not been seen for a very long time laughed very loudly after they had a nice conversation. The warrior, in turn, also really missed such dialogues, and therefore he also laughed sincerely. Then he said that his bad character remained with him, while simultaneously pulling the axe out of his boot. Then the dwarf said that he still continued to eat rice with spoons. The commander approached his old friend and asked who he was, calling him Kamunwan. The warrior began to scream very loudly when he heard this word, and asked the commander how he even dares to call his subordinates that way. Yes, he looked like a lazy person, but his skill was the same. Therefore, he ordered him to treat him well, despite his cheeky military life. Dvor, who was a friend, turned to the commander and said that he was called a great warrior. Of course, the strong Firkin did not want his friend to tell this to everyone, but now there was nothing to do. But the old friend looked at the warrior and thought that this was what he needed. Then the commander asked for forgiveness for his rudeness, and said that he had a different meaning behind these words, also adding that Mr. Rarick is currently a military advisor. Then Firkin turned his head towards the dwarf and asked, "Is he really retired?" The old man answered him that he was no longer as young as he thought. His back was already hurting so much that even an axe was very difficult to sharpen. The warrior said that before his back was much stronger. Rarick was a little angry when he said this, but still decided to ignore his emotions and asked the warrior what brought him here. Moreover, the dwarf was even more interested in what kind of monsters he came here with, because if you took a closer look, you could see that among his friends was the Phantom King. Then the warrior said that it would take a very long time to explain all this, but he would try to explain everything more briefly, so you need to listen carefully. He leaned over and whispered something in Rarick's ear for a few seconds, and everyone watched the dwarf's surprised face. He looked at his old friend and asked if it was true. Artofrican replied that he was not lying. The dwarf grabbed his axe even more tightly, and this instilled a slight tension, despite the fact that before that everything was calm. And then he laughed and asked if the warrior was really going to turn Bandal into a lich in order to find the holy sword. After this, the dwarf very suddenly stopped laughing and asked the Firkin if he was crazy, to which he replied that it was the world that made him that way. It was not difficult to guess that the warrior came here solely to get the magic stone. The tone of the conversation became more serious, and the warrior added that he was glad that the conversation had come in the right direction, since he really needed the heart of the earth. He needed to convince the palace, so he said that he was not a reckless person, so that the heart of the earth would be in safe hands. But suddenly, Rurik said that he could take this artifact if he could somehow get it. Rurik says this for a reason. In fact, it would be good if the warrior managed to deal with this problem. The problem was that there were a very large number of mosquitoes near the artifact itself, and the warrior knew about this. The dwarf notified everyone that Vladriel, a pesky insect that appeared there last month, took over the fortress along with the captive dwarves. Of course, it is obvious that someone who can fly well is a special problem for gnomes. The warrior asked his friend what about the warriors from the lava anvil, to which Rurik replied that he and the mosquitoes are not the only ones who are looking for the heart of the earth stone. When they descended deep into the mountain range, they spent generations mining or in order to achieve their goal. And one day, they managed to discover the heart, and this meant that the work could be completed. But then they did not know that by finding the heart of the earth, in fact, they only added even more problems to themselves. After learning about the discovery of the heart, various raiders began to come running to them, who persuaded them to share this artifact. And after that, they depleted all the reserves in order to keep them, and eventually lost their main fortress. It is not so easy to recapture it, since vampires take people hostage, and if they rush, this can lead to disastrous consequences. These magic stones and other rubbish were already the biggest problem for the dwarf, and therefore Rurik decided that he would let Furin take him and throw him away. The warrior was silent for some time, and then he was very glad that it was much easier to complete this task than he had initially thought. Therefore, he agreed for his friend, and said that so be it, he would transfer the head, heart, and even stomach of this main mosquito. Then Rurik thought that it seemed that his friend did not listen at all, precisely the part that because of this haste, people could get hurt. But the warrior believed that he needed to wake up, since it would be impossible to save everyone anyway. Many more people sacrifice while they do nothing. The dwarf sighed while the strong Furin walked away and said that he should not worry, since the warrior is an expert in killings. There was one more piece of information that the dwarf did not tell his old friend before someone went on a mission, and when he said that such information was available, the strong Furin immediately turned his head. Then Rurik said that Vladriel is not alone there, and the problem is actually much more significant. There's another one out there that can actually even rival the vampire precursor in power. Meanwhile, for some reason, the dwarven commander began to feel incredibly ill and began to foam at the mouth. A few more moments, and he jumped on the warrior with his spear and wanted to pierce his head. Furin the Strong was very scared when this happened, but his reaction was fine. Therefore, with just one blow he was able to stop the dwarf, who wanted to strike him from the air. It was not clear why the commander's sudden aggression, and why he suddenly wanted to scare the warrior. When the strong Furin began to look around, he realized that all the other dwarves were also in the same condition as their commander. Their eyes glowed red, and their bodies emitted a barely noticeable violet energy flow. Then it became obvious to the warrior that the whole detachment had suffered something, and it seemed they wanted to fight. Rurik came closer to him and said that this was all due to the fact that the main enemy had arrived at the place, and if at that time you looked at the mountain that was nearby, you could understand that the volume of the problem was incredibly large, of dwarves under his command. Their enemy will be none other than the cursor Mogali's Duran. Then the strong Furin said that now he would evaluate this opponent and break his neck. But Rurik suddenly shouted at him not to do this. It seems that the warrior completely forgot that if you look at his helmet, you will immediately lose your mind. He also forgot that similar things had happened in the past, so Rurik ordered the warrior to focus on his words so as not to get lost. He said that if the warrior is ready, then let him retreat a little, since it is Rurik who wants to strike the first blow. Well, when the dwarf didn't hear any reaction, he realized that the problem was much bigger than he initially expected. Looking at the face of the strong Furin, one could understand that he was now also possessed and subservient to Duran. The warrior immediately fell into his own sleep, and returned to the time where he was still young. Before him were three very familiar faces that he would like to see in real life. The first of these was Ben-Al. It would be difficult to exaggerate if we said that this was none other than the warrior's best friend. There was also a human king there, whom they also saw very often and had a lot of memories. And of course, Adal stood right before his eyes. He couldn't believe that this was all happening in reality, and that everything was fine with him. It was this fact that prevented him from completely immersing himself in hypnosis. Firkin the Strong quickly realized that this was just a cheap dream. The greatest danger was the dwarves, since there were a very large number of them, and they were well trained as warriors. But one of the warrior's friends knew how to deal with this problem, and quickly ran up to one of them. When he did this, his eyes began to glow blue, and he redirected his energy through his hands directly into the dwarf's head. Then the eyes of this same dwarf, which had just glowed red, very sharply and quickly began to go out. A few seconds later he shouted that he would not be the master's slave, and pupils could again be seen in his eyes. Then the essence of the forest took a few steps away from him, and the gnome came to his senses. This had to be done with several more, and all the dwarves very quickly came to their senses, although they still had little understanding of what was happening around them. One of them raised his spear up and ordered them to prepare for battle if they had already come to their senses. Since there was still a very large group of dwarves who were angry and looked like real madmen, Resurrecting approached the essence of the forest, and told him that in fact he wanted to tell him something very important. Namely, the real problem is now hidden, and solving it will be the most correct solution. Of course, this problem is the strong Firkin, because in this state he is the most dangerous of all. His eyes were shrouded in madness and glowed red, and from time to time he uttered different names. Before Resurrecting began to run towards him, he said. A few seconds later the dwarf swung his axe and said that he would finish the warrior by any means necessary. But for the strong it was not even a task, since he struck with his fists right on Resurrecting's chin. The dwarf flew to the side at high speed and shouted the word back very loudly, as it hurt incredibly badly. The mercenary at that moment realized that this was his chance to attack, and therefore he rushed towards the warrior at incredibly high speed. He flew into his body at high speed, but the strong Firkin managed to take a defensive stance. When he stood on defense, he still spoke one word per minute. This time it was the next word. The mercenary retreated a little and said that it seemed that the warrior had completely lost his mind, and therefore it was necessary to bring him back to his senses with the help of magic. The dwarf who was watching everything that was happening said that it seems that this old man, despite his age, is still swinging his fists well. Moreover, he noticed that the Lord of the Dead was lying next to him on a chaise lounge made of bones, but for some reason he was not doing anything. When he asked this question to the Lord, he replied that Resurrecting himself was already so decrepit that he could not withstand the blows of his fighting friend. Then he replied that he was probably joking, since it was obvious that the Phantom King had not taken the righteous path, and was simply using everyone he missed. There was a short pause, after which the warrior's friend said that if not now, then the Phantom King would never again have a chance to fight with Firkin. This made him think, and after a while he said that so be it, he would accept this temporary union. Resurrecting was a master of sarcasm, so he said that this moment was worth living for, in order to unite with the ghostly king in the fight against the warrior. The Phantom King's magic was very strong, so he did not require the dwarf's help, but instead began to emit magic from his hands. He began to approach his target, and in a quiet voice said that such an ordinary shock was of no use at all. The only way he knew of that could dispel the control was to kill the caster. Or perhaps there is another way, for example, to influence the target directly, as the mercenary has already tried to do, but he did it rather poorly, since a strong Firkin stood in front of him and was preparing to finish him off. Meanwhile, the warrior was immersed in his dreams, and saw in front of him the last seconds of the life of the two-headed dragon. With the help of his sword, he eliminated this dragon, and its body fell immobilized to the ground. Then the warrior raised his sword and thought what pathetic phrase to shout now to make it sound best. When he picked it up, he shouted that their team was moving towards victory and battle. But when there was no answer, he turned to the others and asked them to speak forward when he said that they were moving towards victory. Firkin, the strong man of today, watched all this and wondered what a weakling he was before. He had a lot of weaknesses from his past, and even the battle with the two-headed dragon seemed incredibly difficult to him. This made him think, and after a few seconds the warrior thought that this was clearly a dream, and he had the feeling that he also had some more important business. But it seems that this matter was not particularly important, since he did not remember about it, and therefore decided to just enjoy his sleep. Firkin from the past said that they need to keep moving since the enemy was defeated. Then the warrior agreed that these times were not bad, and all these adventures with the four of them were much more fun than those that exist now. Perhaps if it weren't for the war with the demons, he would have been with everyone else. We laughed and chatted as before, but suddenly, someone appeared behind him and said that this was all just in words, and there was no confirmation of this. When the warrior turned his head, he saw an image already familiar to him that was addressing him. He asked what the hell this was all about, since he already remembered a similar familiar and very vile intonation. The image said that it was in Furin that the reason for his loneliness. But he still doesn't seem to see this in others. The warrior ordered him to shut up right now, since he would not understand what it was like to be happy. The image began to laugh and said that it is unlikely that Furin himself is strong. He is confident in the words he utters, since he knows well that it was he who lost the holy sword, and it was because of him that Adal died. This image turned into a young version of the warrior, who said that all the troubles that happened were solely because of him. Then the warrior from the present said that he was not so daring in his youth, and therefore I would advise this image to open his mouth too. Young versions of Furin, and they said that the warrior would not have sacrificed Ariel if he had not lost his sword. Then the human king would not have changed if Ariel were here. And Adal would not have died because of all this. And the warrior would not have lost his 100th sword. This psychological pressure did not have any strong influence on Furin, and he said that he was still trying very hard to find the sword and turn back time. But the image from his youth was against this, and said that, to be honest, it is shame that is the reason why a warrior is looking for his sword. He just wants to get rid of the stigma of being a warrior who lost his sword. And on top of everything, take revenge on the demon king. This was the true reason why the warrior craved the holy sword. Then the image of the young Furin strong became older, and his voice became more hoarse. This image said that this is all true, and warriors really only think about themselves, since only he can wield the holy sword. A second later, all the images disappeared, and someone familiar grabbed the warrior by the shoulder. When he turned his head, he saw that the Phantom King was standing there, who said that the warrior should dodge this blow. A phantom guillotine appeared directly above his head and would activate any second now. Then the Lord told Furin the Strong that now was the most important moment in his life, since he would have to wake up, or otherwise, he will simply die right on this spot without leaving any memories of himself. The energy from this spell spread in different directions, and Resurrecting, who was trying to stand on his feet, said that even though the warrior was strong, he would clearly be hit by such an attack. But everyone tensed up a little when the warrior did absolutely nothing for a while, and then exhaled all the air that was in his lungs. The dwarf looked at his old friend, and saw him in a form in which he had not seen for too long. The warrior swung his hand, and it hovered for a second in space, extracting an incredible amount of light energy. It was as if the heavens were helping him by adding energy to that fist, which flew into the ground at very high speed under his feet. This swing was as strong an effort as it was slow. The mercenary even managed to shout to everyone who was near him to immediately run away as fast as they could. But when he looked at Resurrecting, who was nearby, he simply lay down on the floor and said that he was taking the pose of a nuclear bomb falling. This blow was simply incredible, and even in the warrior's eyes one could see the absence of any light. Everyone stood in a protective position and waited for this to happen, since it was obvious that there would be a large release of energy. The glow stopped getting brighter, but it was incredibly interesting how it would all end in the end. The Phantom King looked at what was happening through his fingers and his block, because he wanted to see what was happening in the epicenter itself. My turn closed my eyes, because I thought that perhaps this energy would break through his block and kill him. Well, when the glow became quieter, he opened his eyes and looked straight at the Furin. The Phantom King had already completely lowered his hands, and laughed, as he realized that it seemed that half of the mission had already been completed. What happened was that the warrior finally came to his senses. The warrior had a small abrasion on his right cheek, from which smoke came out for some time. Then the mercenary suggested out loud that it looked like the warrior had woken up after his own slap in the face. Resurrecting was glad that they managed to bring him to consciousness. The warrior adjusted his neck a little, since after such a strong blow it had shifted a little, and then he said that now his mood sucks, after what he saw in his dream. Meanwhile, the horse Durant was riding on suddenly screamed very loudly and rose higher up the mountain. Having pushed off from it, the distance from the hooves to the surface was now approximately 20 centimeters. It became noticeable to everyone who watched the enemy that he seemed to be able to fly, and quite unhindered. The Phantom King approached the warrior to ask if he really woke up after his blow. He replied that it was really painful, and also added that he remembered Duran, who had also spoiled his mood before. The Phantom King remembered that the warrior is weak to mental attacks. Meanwhile, Furin told Rerik that if you just squint your eyes, then you don't have to be afraid of falling into hypnosis. The enemy levitated in the air and looked at his enemies, who simply did nothing and looked approximately in his direction. He looked really scary, as he was a horseman on a ghostly horse without a head. Suddenly the head spoke and said that he had not seen the warrior for many decades. He knew that it was Furin, since only a man of his height could do such a thing. He also asked the warrior whether he liked the gift he was given. Was he glad to meet his old friend? And he added that it was a pity that he was returned to consciousness, since living in those dreams would be very charming. The warrior did not answer him, and his squinted eyes could only tell Duran that he was slightly out of his mind. Furin turned his head towards the Phantom King because he couldn't hear anything he was saying, and the Lord answered him that it was probably because he had no vocal cords. The enemy said that he missed another person. Of course, he meant the Phantom King, who seemed to have become an obedient warrior dog. At that moment, Duran wanted to say something, but a mercenary somehow flew up to him from the air and swung his stick. He struck several times, but the enemy managed to fly a short distance to the side. Even though Duran managed to dodge, he was still shocked that an ordinary person flew to this point so easily. As he said this, 3 dwarves immediately attacked him from the air and tried to stab him with their spears. The blows became more and more frequent, but Duran again moved in the air in order to dodge all these attacks. When, after the attack, the dwarves began to fall down, the phantom hand caught them, despite the fact that the damage to their backs still occurred. Duran was confused, as he did not understand where the opponents were flying at him from. But when he turned his head, he saw that the entity of the forest was standing on the ground, and holding in his hand one dwarf with a spear. Then the warrior shouted to Udan to prepare for a single shot from the dwarf. Now it is obvious to Duran that the one who did this was the monster, which deprived him of the dwarf's mind control. He immediately began to move when he realized this, and everyone who watched him did not even immediately realize this. In a quiet voice, Duran said that he would destroy this monster right now. Meanwhile, the warrior ordered the entity to prepare the next dwarf. Furin was very surprised that the enemy was so fast, because after half a second he was already almost near the face of the forest entity. But at the very last moment, Udan's eyes began to glow with a pink light, and then Duran felt some strange feeling inside his stomach. A moment, and his horse was already standing on green grass, which turned out to be greener than all the grass he had seen in his life. Taking advantage of this condition, the horse immediately began to eat this grass, and ignored Duran's orders. The villain did not understand where he was, and what all this had just happened, but it was only obvious that my soul was incredibly calm, and it looked like this clumsy monster had a flower garden in his head. Moreover, it was not clear where this monster was now, since it was obvious that I was his soul somewhere nearby. The monster increased in size several dozen times and swung its arm to strike the Duran. Another moment, and the horse was very frightened when the hand had almost overtaken his body. Duran shifted into reality, and screamed very loudly due to the fact that his body was shrouded in panic. He started shouting very loudly that he was not a rhinoceros beetle, or even a stag beetle. Then a warrior, whose eyes were still squinted, approached him and greeted the stag. He asked him to finish this as he really doesn't like to postpone such tasks. Duran told him that he didn't know what their group had just used, but the fact that his guys couldn't do anything remained the same. His voice became louder when he told the warrior that not everyone fights because the Furin himself is strong. All the dwarves around suddenly became mad again, and only the Phantom King who stood between them did not react at all. Duran wanted to say something else, but he was interrupted by the warrior, who again swung his fist, which emitted light energy, and a crack of incredible size appeared in the ground, and the warrior said that he had already said that he did not like to postpone things until later. The energy spread through the ground, and because of this, the cracks and the upper rock were cracking at an incredible speed. Moreover, all the techniques that Duran used were also destroyed due to the incredible power of energy. Rerik stood next to the Phantom King and told him to be careful, since this was the aura of death he was familiar with after 3 techniques. Duran thought that he would not even feel this attack, but after some time he felt an explosion in his stomach. It seemed absurd because for some reason the head separated from the hand and began to fly in an unknown direction. A few seconds later, the head fell to the floor right next to the feet of the Phantom King, who seemed to be waiting for this moment. He just stood and looked at her, realizing that this moment had finally come. This was not on his to-do list for today, but it was hard not to take advantage of this chance. When the Lord of the Dead picked up this artifact, Durant began to shout that he did not know what he was doing. Then his signature smile appeared on the Phantom King's face, and he said the following. The Dark Magician said that it was just a small thing, and he would just borrow his head for a while. Meanwhile, the warrior and the mercenary captured what was left of Duran, namely, his body, which under some force could still stand on its feet and endure the blows of the strong Firkin. The warrior struck one after another while the Phantom King behind him placed Duran's helmet on his head. Firkin, the strong ones, noticed this very quickly and turned his head towards his subordinate. When he saw this, he became very tense, since now the Lord of the Dead had a very valuable artifact that adds a lot of strength. Therefore, he turned to him and said that perhaps he should not have appropriated someone else's property without shame. When he did not answer, the warrior suggested that it seemed that the Phantom King was planning a rebellion. But coming closer, his comrades said that he did not commit such stupid things that were dangerous to his life. In fact, he came here to use this helmet for its intended purpose on one of their comrades. Being as close as possible, he used Duran on the mercenary's mind, and said that he needed to check something in Adal's head. Namely, he was wondering if what the mercenary said not so long ago was true. The mercenary was very frightened when this began to happen, since the energy that this helmet emitted was difficult to confuse with something. His eyes suddenly became blank, and it was at that moment that the Phantom King moved. Now he was in another dimension, and could feel something solid on his feet. It looks like he is now in some kind of small hut that is made entirely of wood. Looking around, he realized that someone lived here, and also in this shabby hut there were a lot of valuable magical books. Through the window that led to the street one could see an incredible glow, most likely from some kind of magic. This made the Phantom King slightly open his helmet, and he became very interested in what was on the other side of the window. He began to move closer to the exit, and when he went out into the street he wondered where Adal himself was. The moment he got there, lightning struck just a few centimeters from his feet. There was a very large spirit that was summoned and accumulated a large amount of lightning above its head. After that, he directed this entire attack at the little Adal, and asked if he could cope with 1,000,000 volts. In response to this, the boy only raised his hand, and then the spirit realized that it seemed he had something to answer. Just one movement of the hand was enough to create an impenetrable protective ball around oneself. Then the spirit panicked very much and said that this simply cannot be, and he does not believe it. Confidence could be seen on the little boy's face as he was able to protect himself with one spell. Why did he ask the spirit how many amperes there would be in 1,000,000 volts? The spirit sent another small amount of energy, and said that it did not know the answer. Then the boy began to accumulate energy in his hand and prepare for a counterattack. And when this energy struck the enemy's body, he shouted out a formula with which one can find the current strength. The heart that was in that spirit instantly burst from the fact that such an amount of energy passed through it. This was a first-class electric knight, and he couldn't believe that he had just lost to some schoolboy. But the most surprised of all was the Phantom King, who did not even suspect that the boy could have so much power. And it seems that this was his past, but also the Lord of the Dead could not believe it only because there were many inconsistencies. At about 10 years old, Adal possessed magical powers comparable to great magicians. This boy took a few steps, after which he turned to an old man who was sitting on a stump nearby. When he turned his head in his direction, he asked Master Halvar how he liked his skill. Now the Ghost King realized that the great sage Halvar Brighton was sitting on this stump, and it seemed that he really was Adal's teacher. The boy began to shout that his grandfather could see that he was definitely stronger than the others, since he could handle the peak of lightning. He constantly proved to him that he could now protect himself, and he could already leave this forest as he had promised. But the grandfather was silent for some time, and after that he said that Adal was still weak. The boy was simply furious after all this, especially when the Kalvar told him not to be arrogant, since even some old man was capable of such a thing. He also added that knowledge is power, and therefore the boy should stop whining and continue to build his strength here. It seems that Adal might not even think about leaving the forest or resting, since his grandfather ordered him to remain calm further. Then the boy was very offended and began to leave his teacher, and shouted several more times that he had turned off the lightning. Walking away, the Phantom King looked after this boy and laughed. It was strange, because at first glance this kid was very strong. The man managed to defeat the powerful spirit, and this fact itself was no longer comprehensible to the mind. It was not yet clear why this grandfather was lying to him, and what he was hiding if he did this. And what does it even mean to leave the forest? This was very suspicious, especially the fact that such a capable and strong boy was now much weaker. Meanwhile, the Lord of the Dead approached the mysterious gate that stood in this forest, and decided that he needed to go into it. Having opened these gates, he saw the very bright light that they emitted, and this only made it more interesting. It was necessary to find out what Adal was hiding behind these gates, and what secrets his brain kept. But at the very last moment, before opening the gate, the Phantom King heard his name. He felt someone's gaze behind him, and realized that it was Adal's teacher speaking to him. It was funny, because it seems that Adal himself controls his consciousness, and does not allow the ghostly king to pass on. Then the Halvar moved straight to the gate, and said that this was no place for the Phantom King. From that moment on, the Lord of the Dead already felt uneasy, and he became even more curious about what was behind those gates. Halvar's eyes became green and empty, and he said that from now on the Ghost King would not go further. He also added that he is the 13th Lich. Halvar Brighton will always keep an eye on the Ghostly King from now on. He expelled the Lord of the Dead from his world, and being in reality, the Phantom King immediately threw off the helmet from his head. Now he was lying on the floor and smiling because he was pleased with what he managed to find out. It was necessary to sort out all the thoughts, and lying here on the floor and not moving was quite easy to do. A warrior approached him and asked what he was doing in this helmet. The Lord answered him that it seems that the strong Firkin was right. The hero asked him to explain normally what he wanted to say. Then the king said that a strong great sage lives inside that boy. And this Adal, also at the age of 10, had strength comparable to experienced magicians. The mercenary was unpleasant to hear about these words, especially considering that they had just rummaged through his head. The Ghost King turned his head towards the mercenary and pointed his finger at him, adding that everything was there. He said that it is in Adal's head that everything a warrior needs is located. Further actions took place in the capital of the Iron Empire, which everyone called Eider. A castle of incredible size was built here, which impressed everyone who came with its scale and architecture. 2 warriors were training inside, and it was not yet clear which of them held the palm. Looks like it was Zargan Orn who trained with his subordinates. It was incredibly difficult for him to parry the blows of his opponent, who was moving very quickly. But at one point, Orn's sword ended up right next to the neck of a girl who was in his squad. Then he laughed and said that in general he did not know how this battle would end. He admitted defeat, and said that he never managed to defeat this girl. At this moment, in the other corner of the room, claps could be heard, and a man said that this fight was truly impressive. This man was the vice-captain of the First Order of Knighthood named Dukan Farwan, and he noticed that he still had not gotten rid of the habit of straining his shoulders during a fight. Orn immediately asked the uninvited guest what he wanted, since they alone did not exchange greetings or anything like that. Then Dukan came closer to him, and said that it seemed that the rumors were true that Orn had failed his mission. He came even closer and said that this was really funny, and he had not heard anything like this for a very long time. He didn't like that he was pretending to be cool, but in reality he failed the mission, and also lost his second sword. He didn't understand why he shouldn't hide in a corner instead of denigrating the name of the First Knightly Order. It turns out that a similar situation has already happened to this warrior in the past. All these words incredibly hurt Orn's dignity, but since he was raised very correctly, he tried not to show it to Dukan. Suddenly, the girl took off her helmet and asked the 2 men to stop arguing about something incomprehensible. The girl looked truly magnificent and incredible, and her beauty itself was enough for Dukan to calm down. He immediately put away his sword and said that so be it this time, Cal will listen Rose. After this, he invited the girl to come over to his side, since it would be wasteful to allow someone like her to rot in this detachment. But without thinking for a second, the girl said that she was refusing this offer. And then Dukan said that the battlefield suits her. I even paused, as the girl again said that she had a 4-day job here, and therefore she could not and did not want to change teams. Dukan realized his defeat, and, maintaining a confident appearance, began to leave the training room. At that time, Orn said that he just wanted to relax, but because of this uninvited guest, all the fun went to hell. Being almost near the exit, the vice-captain of the First Order of Knighthood said that he almost forgot the information he wanted to say. Namely, he wants to know where Furin Strong is now, since, by order of His Majesty, the mission of the warrior was transferred to him. And it seems that the Emperor has transferred all power over their mistakes. Orn to hear this, and he became very angry, and even these emotions could be seen from the outside. He started laughing after a few seconds, and Dukhan Farwen thought that he had already gone completely crazy. But when the deputy commander of the First Knightly Order calmed down, it was said that now the Lord of Light would meet a guy who wanted to see him. Further on, the actions unfolded in that place, and while the Phantom King pointed to the mercenary and said that there was a solution to all problems, Strong at first he didn't understand what the Lord of the Dead meant at all, and asked if the solution was inside his body. He looked towards Adal and thought what he meant when he said everything exactly like that. He looked the mercenary up and down, and asked if the Phantom King really wants to say that Adal is a holy sword. The mercenary was very scared when he heard this wording, and could not understand what it even meant. Then the Lord of the Dead said that Adal is not a holy sword. It's just that a huge piece of magical energy is sealed inside it. He also added that he could not test it because of the sage, but that magic power was comparable to the heart of the earth. It turns out that the Lord of the Dead wants to say that he is my holy sword, but the living heart of the earth. The Ghost King agreed, and received several weak blows from the warrior, for explaining everything incomprehensibly. Then the warrior thought that a sacrifice was needed in order to bring everything together. Therefore, they used mercenaries as a sacrifice instead of the heart of the earth, and then the task can be considered completed. The Phantom King said that everything is so, and there is no problem with it. But the warrior saw the problems clearly. The essence is in the deity. It was necessary to take his soul, and then no one would notice, but it turned out that he was a magician. And it won't be possible to do without magic. The mercenary said that it would be impossible to do without magic due to the fact that no one could break the seal inside him. For this reason, he was looking for a teacher, since he sealed his magical power, and the only one who can break the seal is him. This situation was not pleasant, since now in order to achieve the final goal it was necessary to complete several more additional ones. Meanwhile, Resurrecting picked up the helmet from the floor and asked the warrior what they would do with it. Then Furin looked at the immobilized body of their enemy, and decided that it looked like he had died. But the Phantom King did not agree with this, since it seemed that he was simply passed out. Duran is a golem, one of the living armors created by the ancient Great Master Amma. Hundreds of years after Amma's death, the Demon King discovered living armor in his temple that protected the legacy. He revived the strongest and made him the supreme commander. This is the current Durant. The Phantom King also showed the warrior that there was a small switch inside the helmet. If you turn it on, Duran immediately began to shout that he was soon showing his true strength, and if you turn it off, it goes silent. Furin Strong was wondering if there was a remote control for this thing to make it a little easier to control. Then the Lord of the Dead offered to go catch this mosquito, grab it, and take the heart of the earth for himself. But the dwarf said that they still needed to get into the castle somehow. The warrior replied that the best way was to go on foot, but then Resurrecting asked to think about his people. Now it was necessary to find out whether there were spare or secret passages in order to reach the final point. There were moves, but Resurrecting lost sight of that guy's warhorse, and therefore the master will obviously strengthen his security when the horse arrives without a rider. According to the warrior, they will now have to go through the main entrance, but they had to think about another way, since they have an enemy general on their hands. Then Resurrecting offered to talk, since negotiations had never failed in such missions. It was necessary to think a little more about the best way to solve the problem, and for some reason the strong Furin began to stare at the Phantom King. The Phantom King held the helmet in his hands, and this is what prompted him to come up with a better way. It seems that some kind of connection between their consciousnesses made the Lord of the Dead understand what kind of method it was. The action moved to the main castle, where several vampires stood at the entrance, and looked at whoever was approaching them. Someone approached them, who was very familiar, and two guards assumed that this was Sir Duran. Then this character came closer and said that this was him, Margulies Durand. But at this moment, The most interesting action took place in the forge, which was closest to the place that everyone was talking about all the time. The dwarves who were here worked very hard on the stone, which they managed to obtain with great difficulty. The whole process was especially closely watched by the girl, who had to control everything in order to avoid any mistakes. When she struck the final blow on the stone, something not entirely clear began to happen. Then the courtyard that was her assistant said that the state of the heart of the earth does not seem to be particularly stable right now. This small piece of the heart of the earth rose into the air and began to extract a large amount of energy and attract objects to itself. Then the dwarf said that he could congratulate everyone, since the heart of the earth had turned into the purified heart of the earth. Everyone who was around the girl was happy that they had finally cleared it, and the work of 3 sleepless days and nights may seem finished. But the girl did not react in any way, as she was closely watching the stone because of its condition. It was only necessary to look at him a little more carefully to see that his condition is now completely unstable. When she saw a small crack in the stone, she broke it with her hammer and said that everything was not as it should be. The dwarves held their heads, as they realized that it looked like they would also be working a lot today. The girl explained that no matter how successful the cleaning is, everything is useless if the speed is low. It will not last long and will break at the slightest impact. So it was necessary to restart the melting furnace as it needed to be tried again at a higher speed. The dwarf told the girl that in this case they would not be able to cope with the explosion of magical energy. And when she thought about it, she asked him how many masons were left. When the dwarf did not know what to say, the girl answered him that right now the dwarfs are being treated like slaves and they are dying. Therefore, they too must risk their lives to complete the job. The dwarves thought about it, and quickly realized that there was still a lot of work to be done, and it seemed that they would not return home soon. The girl, meanwhile, took a small fragment and gazed at it from her hands. It turns out that all this time the vampire lord was standing right behind her. She turned around to ask him when he arrived, and how long he had been watching everything. Who did you answer that he was just keeping an eye on the girl, because he felt that a huge amount of magical power was being extracted from here. He took a small fragment of stone and was surprised that such a small thing could release such a large amount of power. The girl got to work and told the master that they were almost finished, so he would have to wait and keep his promise. It was necessary to bring the matter to the end, since the safety of the dwarves was on the shoulders of this little girl. The master reassured her and said that she had better hurry up, otherwise at one moment his patience might burst. Then he came even closer to her and put his hand on her shoulder, preparing to say the following. He informed her that in this case, the dwarves would no longer enjoy a 4-day work week. Previously, he had not said that outsiders could sign labor insurance, but in the girl's opinion, the master was the outsider here. The master began to leave the forge, when suddenly his ward ran up to him and said that he had a very important message. It was so important that the subordinates asked the master to look at it himself. When they walked through several rooms, they saw the horse on which Durand usually rode. It was his horse, and the master knew this for sure. Then the subordinate said that she was lost, and so he brought her to this room. This could only mean that it looked like Margulies was in trouble. But this turned out to be impossible, unless this was the work of the Order's punishers. It was not clear how far these opponents could go, so the master gave the order to his subordinate to double the security from the castle gates to the secret passage itself. The resurrection of the Demon King was not far off, so it was impossible to let anyone interfere with them. Meanwhile, a small group moved through the dark basement, and were led in by several vampires. There were several people in this group, and therefore the vampires who were here reacted very sharply to their presence. They screamed and wanted to tear them to pieces right now, but they understood that this would not be possible, all due to the fact that Durand himself leads them to the master, so that he decides their fate. Among these people were the entire group of the warrior, and of course the Firkin himself was strong. On the way, one of the vampires said that these nits destroyed their brothers, and he was surprised that Durand caught them himself. The vampire could not understand what kind of magic he had that could easily deal with such strong opponents. Some time ago, the warrior promised the ghostly lord that he would return the title of the Ghost King to him if he followed orders. Moreover, perhaps he would even be promoted to the Phantom Emperor, but it seemed that the Lord of the Dead was not particularly impressed. Then the warrior simply told him in a friendly way that he was the only one who could copy Durand. The ability to carry one's own head is a great talent that is worth applying here. Then the Ghost King laughed and asked what he should do. Attack and destroy everyone as soon as he gets there? But then Rerik got into the dialogue, who notified everyone that they first needed to cleanse the magical energy of the stone. I don't know that gnomes are the only ones who are fully capable of this. Therefore, if a warrior really wants to get the heart of the earth, then it would not hurt him to help the dwarves too. Furin hugged the Phantom King and said that, as always, they would kill 2 birds with 1 stone, saving people and getting what they want. Then the Lord of the Dead suddenly disappeared and moved directly behind the warrior, after which she said that all he wants is to eventually take the soul of the strong Furin. But the hero replied that these were just great dreams, unlike the warrior's dreams, which only consisted in the Lord of the Dead parodying Duran. He said that he didn't like it, but since this is the only way, he will disguise himself and enter the castle. When he asked what he should do next, the hero replied that he already had a very clear plan. The Phantom King needs to pretend to have captured the entire group, and he tied everyone up and entered the castle. Then they go to the prison and take away the captive dwarves. Meanwhile, he holds the master so that he does not run away. The plan was ideal, and while moving, Duran asked one of the vampires where the master was now. But for some reason, the vampires stopped and began to look at the people he was leading. Then they screamed very loudly and said that the master had given the order to finish them off right here. Then one of them struck with his hand directly at the warrior's head, since he was standing closest to him. He experienced incredibly severe pain, and when he looked at his hand, he realized that all the fingers on this hand were broken. Furin looked at the poor vampire and asked why he was screaming so loudly in pain. Then he hit him right on the body, and the vampire flew at high speed into Duran, who was standing a short distance from the scene. Due to the fact that he flew into him, the helmet immediately fell out of his hands and began to fall to the ground. The vampires stopped paying attention to their enemies, and all their attention was focused on the helmet, which was slowly rolling along the ground. It turns out that this helmet contained the head of the Phantom King, and while on Earth he said that it looked like he would be demoted again. By that time, Furin the Strong had broken his bonds, and said that it seemed that everything had gone as usual. Everyone who was behind him also broke their shackles, and then their commander said that they would have to act according to the situation. A vampire couple was guarding the entrance to one of the rooms, and suddenly they saw someone approaching. They immediately shouted to the stranger to stop and tell him who he was. It was Furin who was strong, and despite all these threats he still continued to come closer and closer. When he got close enough, he told the vampires that he was none other than their killer. The vampires didn't believe it, and Lee said that killers don't talk like that, and once again asked him to introduce himself. But he never had time to say anything, because at great speed he flew straight into one of them. Why did he strike the second with his hand, and thereby eliminated 2 opponents in a second? Now the way inside the room was open, and it was possible to go there without obstacles. He kicked the door, and it immediately opened. The warrior raised her voice very loudly, and told all the dwarves inside that he had come here to save them. But in order to understand what happened next, you need to look into the past, namely 30 minutes ago. The Lord of the Dead, using Duran's helmet, caught one of the vampires and knocked out information from him about where the gnomes were. He named the exact rooms in which they could be, and then the warrior realized that these were exactly the places where they should go. The Lord of the Dead confirmed this information, and asked Furin the Strong whether the other team members had completed their tasks. He said that they are quite strong guys, so they have already dealt with all the vampires. Meanwhile, the warrior said that the Phantom King has a pretty good ability to reattach his head. He also added that once a year he has such a powerful force that can control the mind. Why doesn't he use secret penetration? He said that he simply borrowed the strength of this guy through his helmet, but he is not aiming at larger buildings yet. Duran was equipped with a body to control an army of living armor, and his body specializes in reviving the dead and keeping them autonomous through spells. Then Furin the Strong ignored these words and said that they needed to split up in order to look at all the places mentioned. He asked the Phantom King if he could master a spell that would be used as navigation. After some time, the warrior was already in the room, and found nothing there except old furniture. He looked around, and indeed there was not a single living soul here. Behind him stood a dead vampire who knew where the dwarves were and asked the Furin if he had found the dwarves. Then the warrior turned to the ghostly king to ask if he was sure that he had gone in the right direction. The king replied that this was not the case, since the other places that others went to were also empty. The option that the dead man told them false information was not true, since under the influence of this spell it is impossible to lie. It would be more correct to think that the dwarfs were taken somewhere else. Well, where and why was a much more difficult task. And the Ghost King suggested that they had arranged a buffet for vampires. Or perhaps they guessed they were coming, and for this reason they moved them, without having time to tell all the vampires where their exact location was. The warrior already began to think about what to do next. But at some point the Lord of the Dead said that he saw something from Adal's side. It seems that he stopped because he saw something that interested him. Namely, Adal saw in front of him the bloody body of a dwarf, before whose murder his body was violated. When the warrior heard this information from the Phantom King, his face became even more serious. Adal came closer to the dwarf and covered his body with a small sheet, wishing him a good life in the afterlife. It was very cruel, and the mercenaries suggested that perhaps they had come too late. Suddenly, he saw and heard someone who was in a cage in the corner of this dark room. Taking a closer look, one could notice that there was a gnome there who was very ill, and who, with the last of his strength, was asking to be released. When Adal came closer, he immediately asked if he was okay, and said that he would free him right away. But when he saw the condition of this dwarf, he was very surprised, and for some time he could not even move. His whole body glowed bright blue, and he realized that this was nothing more than a magical addiction. At some point, the gnome gained a lot of strength. He began to glow even brighter and shouted to Adal that he felt very bad. It seemed that this prisoner was out of control, and mana was leaking out of his body, which meant that an explosion was about to happen. The warrior at this time was thinking about what to do next, until he heard an explosion and a small pile of stones fell from the ceiling. Elusiveness the king said that, most likely, this is a real trap, and they fell into a trap. Despite the fact that the explosion was quite significant, Adal was still alive, since in front of him there were several vampires who were already ready to tear his body to pieces. The Lord of the Dead notified Furin the Strong that Adal had been ambushed, and things would not be easy for him. It turns out that the vampires lured him using the gnomes as bait. And the most interesting thing was that before that they forced them to disperse. One of the vampires immediately attacked Adal, but he was ready to strike back. He turned his head, since this vampire was to the side that the mercenary was not looking at. With an accurate blow of his hand, he hit his opponent directly in the forehead, after which he began to fall to the ground. The Phantom King continued to describe what was happening in the room where Adal is now, and how the battle was going. The mercenary did more than well, as he beat the vampires to death with his bare fists. This happened until someone took his fist in their hand. Adal turned his head and saw a vampire behind him, who was already clearly of a higher rank than the previous ones. But he was not afraid, so with a serious look he told this vampire to let go of his fist now. It seems that this enemy was not very talkative, as he did not respond to these words. The Lord of the Dead reported to the warrior that the situation was heating up, and someone else came to the essence of the forest. These were several vampires, and as soon as they began to approach him, they immediately made themselves known. Everything indicated that the master had summoned vampires of a higher rank than those they had seen before. Then the strong Furin began to shake one of the dead, and asked the Lord of the Dead to tell him where the enemies were, and he would destroy everyone. But while he was shaking this vampire, the ridge that was closer to his neck suddenly cracked. This resulted in the vampire dying, and now they had no connection. The Phantom King, who was himself in the room, noticed that he could no longer maintain contact with that vampire. Moreover, he heard some noise behind him, and turned his head to see what was there. There was the most powerful vampire that the Lord of the Dead had seen in his entire existence. I had to think what to do. Meanwhile, the dwarves were near the exit from their own base, and closely watched the gate. The unit commander very closely observed all the changes that can be visually noticed. Then an advisor approached him and said that it seemed that no signal had been given yet. He replied that they needed to continue monitoring, but considering that there was a warrior there, it was strange that the mission was still not over. The advisor said that he was right, since this is truly the strongest warrior of all time, and he must resolve everything. But they still had to stay ready if they wanted all their comrades to return safe and sound and the mission to be accomplished. After some time, they saw some suspicious movement behind them, and immediately turned their heads. It was a stranger who was dressed in rather neat clothes and armor, and stood motionless. After some time, this stranger asked them to put away their spears and listen. He also said that he was not suspicious at all, and he always came only to explain something. Then the dwarves said that just the mask alone made him suspicious, and so they asked him to take it off. Then their acquaintance said that if they wanted to chat, they should put away their weapons. At that very second, this stranger used 100-fold gravity, and directed it directly at all the dwarves. The dwarves could not understand what kind of technique this was, because after a few seconds they all began to levitate in the air. And when they landed, one of them said that in the Middle Ages there was no such thing as gravity, so he didn't know what it was. Then the stranger said that the resistance to magic of gnomes is really amazing, or perhaps they are just very stupid. Dokkan appeared behind the stranger, who said that they were glad to see the gnomes 100-fold in size, and that is why he used this technique. He also asked everyone not to be so careful around them as they are honestly not suspicious guys. Then Rerik answered him that judging by his appearance, we can say that they are clearly not adventurers. He also warned him that now no one can go into the fortress. But the vice-captain of the First Order of Knighthood said that he was not interested in their house, but was just looking for one friend. His name is Firkin Strong, and according to Dokkan himself, the warrior followed this path. Therefore, this stranger told the dwarf that he would be very grateful if he told him where he was now. Meanwhile, the entire castle was shaking due to the fact that there was an incredible battle taking place on every floor. Vladriel moved closer to the ghostly king, and seemed ready to talk to him. The Lord of the Dead had been waiting for this meeting for a long time, and said that it looked very strange. The Master of Vampires, meanwhile, said that he didn't even notice how 30 years had passed, and they hadn't seen each other for such a long time. It was interesting that they met in a castle, and that the first lich under the name of the Phantom King was in this castle at the same time. But suddenly he was interrupted, since a battle was taking place right on the floor above, and the noise was simply unbearable. All these people fought very loudly in the name of Vladriel, as if for a rabble, since one of them was an ordinary unknown mercenary who had been holding the defense for a very long time. The second of them was a huge monster that had incredible strength, and could hold back any opponents, and even one old warrior, who was now engaged in hammering a stone wall in order to achieve an incomprehensible goal. He wondered what the Phantom King, the Great Lich, was doing with all this rabble. He answered him that there was one time when he thought the same way as Vladriel himself, but all this happened until one person was able to defeat him. The vampire master just said to the old warrior, it looks like he didn't know at all that the old warriors tore the spirit apart with his bare hands. Until they were in different places for 30 years, this guy was constantly between life and death, thereby subjugating the omnipotent forces of the continent. The most terrifying thing about him is the tone that his power was not obtained through any magical means. Then the vampire master said that it seemed that the Phantom King had weakened, and therefore chose to bow to the warrior's strength and betrayed the Demon King. The Lord of the Dead turned to his old friend and asked him what he was muttering under his breath. Why did he also add that he is a true member of the Demon King's army, and therefore can hand over anyone? As a member of this army, betrayal was normal for him. But Vladriel, on the other hand, with his honor and loyalty, was hardly on the side of the righteous. Then the vampire master laughed, and said that it seemed that the Phantom King had not lost his fun after years. He once again wanted to raise the topic of betrayal, since it would be better for him to betray the warrior and join the army of the Demon King. Then he replied that even betrayal should have its benefits, and he had no reason to do this, since he also needed to stop the angry warrior. Vladriel said that as a soldier of the Demon King, he must be trusted, since the resurrection of the Demon King is just around the corner. He also added that he would soon have the heart of the earth, and this place was simply teeming with souls for the ritual. And through the sacrifice of the dwarves, the Demon King will be reborn as a lich. The Ghost King asked his interlocutor if he was sure that the Demon King had ever died. This phrase caused confusion on the face of the vampire master, especially when the Lord of the Dead asked if he had seen his corpse. Moreover, it was interesting whether he had encountered his soul, and whether he knew at least one report about his death. Then Vladriel ordered him to shut up, because he could not believe that the Demon King was actually alive. The Phantom King added that he cannot know for sure whether he is alive, so now their king can be called the Schrödinger Demon King. The vampire master did not like that his opponent wanted to make him hesitate with his lying tongue, so he said that this dialogue should be ended. He immediately summoned the Blood Phantom Sword and ordered him to end this boring conversation now. A ghost with a scythe appeared right behind the Lord of the Dead, and then he said that he had always wondered which of the 4 commanders was stronger. Right now was the moment that was most convenient to find out about this. Meanwhile, fighting took place in each of the rooms that a member of the group entered. It was especially difficult for Adal, since he had the largest number of enemies in his room. They constantly tried to strike at him, but he successfully counterattacked and evaded them. The most powerful of the vampires took an advantageous position, and when his target was in the corner, he shouted that they were going to play further. After that, he released a huge amount of flame directly at the enemy, and the mercenary only closed himself with a block. The vampires who stood aside commented on what was happening, since for the first time in their lives they saw such incredible power of fire. The mercenary analyzed his opponent, and realized that since they had a difference in skills, this put him in an advantageous position. He took out a small vial of unknown liquid from his pocket, and prepared to use it. Meanwhile, the vampire, simultaneously drawing streams of flame from his mouth, asked Adal if this is really all he has. Then the mercenary shouted to his enemy that it wouldn't hurt to add some gasoline. At this moment, a protective field immediately appeared around his body, which prevented the fire from spreading forward. The vampire by that moment no longer knew how to act, and was completely confused. Then the mercenary came closer to him, and advised him to start being afraid. This is due to the fact that he has not practiced the following technique for a very long time, which means he may overdo it. At that second, no one in the room understood what power Adal actually possessed. And moreover, I didn't think whether the world was ready for this.